Hello, my fellow Westorians. We are all Hightower today. When all of Westeros, save Dorne and Beyond the Wall, knelt to Aegon, the Conqueror himself in turn knelt at the Starry Sept in Old Town to receive the blessing of the High Septon as the new and first Lord of the Seven Kingdoms. Though the Reach is ruled from Highgarden, the center of the faith in all of Westeros was ruled by House Hightower. I say was because it's no longer the center of the faith in Westeros, though it's still very prominent in that regard. But it was the center for thousands of years and still was for a few generations after the conquest. It gradually shifted to King's Landing. So in this era we're discussing today, the early phase of House Hightower under the Dragons, well, it's going to still be the center of the faith for that time. And with Aegon wielding so much of his... Your arm starting to get tired there, Sean?
Yes.
For those listening, Sean's been holding a House Hightower sigil shirt up over the camera, so you could only see it, and yeah, his arms got
Not
tired.
much commitment to House Hightower if you couldn't keep it going for more than 2 minutes.
We don't really light the way. We just light the way as long as it's convenient.
It was more like that we cover the way.
we
right
cover the camera.
So you're making me feel guilty because I want to be loyal to House Hightower.
Yeah, you should be. Your wife is House Hightower.
It's true.
Yeah, that was actually not a shirt. It was a bag from her Linnes costume.
Oh,
cosplay.
It wasn't a shirt. Okay. Anyway, with Aegon wielding so much of his power through the faith and the Hightower presence at court, which includes several marriages to House Targaryen, we have a house with significant influence over the two most important powers in all the realm. But of course, it doesn't stop there. They rule the second largest city on the continent. But at this time, it was the largest city on the continent. King's Landing didn't surpass Old Town for a little while, and not in those first 45 years of its existence. So we don't actually know when King's Landing surpassed Old Town, but it wasn't this early. And they're accordingly wealthy. Not quite Lannister wealthy, perhaps. Some estimates say they are as wealthy as the Lannisters. Doesn't really matter. They're ridiculously wealthy to a degree that we couldn't even count or fathom. And of course, there's the Citadel. They have a huge amount of influence there, too. So, though it's entirely possible they wielded greater relative strength in ancient times, the era we're discussing today, the conquest to halfway through Maegor's reign, was probably the peak of their power. Add it all up now. Royal influence, religious influence, financial might, control over knowledge, if not communication, because all the ravens go through the Citadel as well. They're trained there. And of course, their military strength, which we haven't mentioned yet, both in manpower and in ships. Well, we got all that and more on this episode of History of Westeros podcast. Hello and welcome, everyone. Time for another deep dive into somewhat recent history of House Hightower, one of the most powerful and prominent houses in all of Westeros, especially among those that are not technically a great house, but wield the strength and power of one. In fact, they're probably a lot more influential than, say, the Greyjoys, who are technically a great house. I think, in fact, I would wager to say that's not even a question. I'd say they definitely are more powerful, but technically they don't have that same rank. Anyway, there's a lot to discuss with them. As often is the case, I underestimate how long an episode is going to be. You'd think I'd learn, but no, I haven't. And I started off thinking we'd do all of the era prior to the dance in one episode. Not even close. Not even half. Although we do know more about this phase than we know about the latter phase. The middle phase, really. The latter phase we know a lot about because that's pre-dance, and that's a juicy time. But we'll be discussing that one next time. This one will be focused on those early years right after the conquest. And how you doing, Sean? What's happening today for you? I see you got a green shirt. I've got a black shirt. It's kind of funny. We're not actually talking about the blacks and the greens, but my black shirt is the Hightower shirt. You have a green shirt that's the Office.
My green shirt's an Office shirt.
Yeah, an Office Beatles shirt, really.
It's a mashup, yeah.
I like it.
Yeah, so it's a three-way mashup without even realizing it. It's a Hightower Office Beatles. I got to ask some of the Office cast a couple questions at the Denver Comic-Con a couple weeks ago, so it's a little extra on my mind.
Hell yeah, that's cool.
Let me point out that I also have a green drink here in honor of the Honorable House Hightower.
It's difficult to have a black beverage. Like you can have a so dark it looks like, but like actual black. Like black coffee isn't actually black. It's brown. You know.
Yeah. Sometimes Coke or Dr. Pepper look pretty black, depending on the
Yeah, it looks
amount
black.
of light
but
you've got on it.
technically,
But
it's brown too, right? Yeah. Anyway.
this is definitely green. It's the Green Machine Naked Drink with Mountain Dew and apple juice and peach mango bang.
Oh, you've been finding your bangs. Good for you.
Yeah, Bang's getting back on the market there, huh?
Reappearing without the creatine advertisement.
Big shout out to Nina. Her blog is goodqueenalley with 1l.tumblr.com. Her notes are in here as usual, and you're going to want to check out goodqueenalley.tumblr.com for her blog post where she answers a lot of questions and does other fun stuff. Lately, there's the most recent post is about Littlefinger and Sansa and how that's going to all work out, whether they're going to logistically, like how the army is going to move from the Vale to the north, like how are they going to get there. The show, of course, just skipped over that like it often does with logistics, but it's no small thing to go from the Vale to the north, especially in winter, which it presumably won't have stopped. Winter it's already started, so I don't suppose it's going to let up in time for the Vale forces to get up there. So that's a good question. Yeah. This episode was voted on by patrons. We have a high-level vote coming up soon because we just put out our episode on Mantaris, which was for patrons and subscribers only. And we'll be voting for another scripted episode. But we have the weekly scripted episode votes as well. And next week will be part 2 of this one. But after that, we're going to have an episode on, drumroll please, Craster. Yes,
Boo.
I put up a boo. Shay says I put up a poll on villains, and y'all were just like, "Yay, Craster!" More than 50% of the vote went to Craster. I never know how these polls are going to go. Sometimes I think I have a handle on who's going to win, but y'all surprise me sometimes. That one was a surprise. I kind of thought people would pick Qyburn maybe, or maybe even Joffrey. Joffrey got like 3% of the vote, so that was not even close.
As bad as Joffrey is, he's not as bad as Craster. He is not as much of a villain. He may have become so if he lived longer.
Yeah,
but
like Joffrey had it in him to do way more damage than Craster, wielding power over far more people. But yeah, I can see. But also, there's no supernatural element to Joffrey. I think that's part of what the draw of Craster is. Like, why? There's more unanswered questions, I think, with Craster.
More speculation to be had about Craster than Joffrey.
Yeah, and things around him, like why is he doing the sacrifices? Anyway, so yeah, we'll discuss all that when the episode's up. And until then, let's talk about House Hightower Under the Dragons. But first, a trivia question that we will answer for you at the end, unless you already know the answer, in which case, good for you. The question is, Maegor wanted to ambush some of the Faith Militant by publicly executing one of their leaders via burning to death. Very pleasant. He expected more poor fellows to rescue this condemned individual. His plan was to ambush the rescuers and thus kill this condemned person and capture and kill a bunch more poor fellows. Who was this person? Given the death penalty, bonus points if you can name the poor fellow leader who fell for this trap, which it was a successful trap. Spoiler alert. And, of course, that's something we'll be talking more about in our Fire and Blood Valar Readus, which starts in only a few weeks, y'all. Getting pretty close. Also, a super chat from TKOK Podcast Network. My own nonsensical headcanon is among the many inspirations for House Hightower. Chief among them is Cadet Moses Hightower of the award-winning and beloved cinematic juggernaut that was the Police Academy franchise. That's right. That guy that did all the... Right. Was it the guy that did all the voices? No, it was the big dude.
I don't think it was.
Like, the big intimidating black guy was Hightower, right? Yeah. He was actually like really tall.
I believe so.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. Moses Hightower. That dude was... Man, they made a lot of those movies, didn't they? Like...
I think there were like 7 or something. Yeah,
a lot of Police Academy. It was like the big franchise of the 80s. Anyway, let's check out...
Ahead of their time.
Yeah. Check out the TKOK Podcast Network for great shows like New Dad Podcast and the Pot Moms Podcast.
And the Movie Club Podcast were most relevant to the Police Academy.
Oh, yeah, good point.
I suppose.
Good call. So
I think Shay and I have each been featured on that podcast. I did The Graduate with Tommy, and Shay, you did Fantastic Planet, right?
I did do Fantastic Planet. Aziz, meanwhile, has done New Dad podcast.
that's right.
Talking about his own home life, family life.
Yes, he had an episode where he interviewed people that don't really know their dads, like me. So yeah,
Who did it? Who don't know dad? New Dad, New Dad, KNEW.
New Dad. I should have been on the No Dad podcast. Yeah. So this one's a slightly different format from the northern one. The north, of course, we covered in 2 episodes, Under the Dragons, but it was the whole north. We were able to focus on each Stark Lord in turn. Here we're more focused on the Targaryen reign. We're not going to go Hightower Lord by Lord, because the Hightowers were far more closely tied to the Targaryens than the Starks ever were or have been since. The north is, in a sense, the Targaryen rule almost made the north more isolated in some ways, whereas House Hightower, almost in reverse, became more embroiled in global, continental politics than they'd ever been before. So the full story of House Hightower, of course, much, much longer than 1 episode. This Under the Dragons series should take us 2 episodes. We'll see, but that's what I expect. Although I'm not great at these estimates, so take that with a grain of salt, or several grains of salt. They've always been pretty important, of course, House Hightower. But interestingly, they haven't been that big in A Song of Ice and Fire. Their role has more increased over the last 10 years, partly because, well, there's been so much time to talk about what's going to happen in A Song of Ice and Fire. And they are pretty big on the yet to come stage. They're on the cusp of mattering a lot. Like, we've got Euron getting ready to do stuff in Old Town. We've got chapters there. Sam's at the Citadel. Jock and Hagar, or some faceless man, is there as well. So yeah, stuff is happening there now, whereas it hasn't so much before. So it's not like their time is past. In fact, their time on stage is still coming. But obviously beyond that, they've gained so much more clout in the fandom because of the World of Ice and Fire, Fire and Blood, and obviously House of the Dragon has really propelled them to prominence within the community and the real world. Out there in the real world, a lot more people have heard Hightower now than they ever have before. So it's...
and a lot of that is not only a lot of new material that Martin has given us about them, even if it is more rooted in the past than the main Song of Ice and Fire series, but that material also shows you how integral they have been in the past, which maybe adds to the potential relevance of them in the future. Like we could probably do entire episodes on it, but they were sort of like the Vatican of the world, right?
That's
the
a good
Sept
point.
It's like the center of religion is in Old Town, and was for thousands of years. So that it's hard to measure that influence.
That's a great point.
And the Citadel, right? They established a Citadel, which is also like a center of learning, but not just a center of learning, but they send out people from there to all the other castles. Like once again, hard to measure the influence that's had over time and will continue to have.
Yeah, there's probably no house that has their fingers in more important, influential, like, centers of culture or just society. What power, knowledge, religion, trade, just everything. There's probably no one besides, because House Targaryen, of course, rules over all that stuff. But as far as directly influencing, it's more like, they just rule it all. It isn't like they're not in there like making moves in the way.
If House Targaryen said, "Hey, Hightowers, do X," and a Hightower said, "Actually, we're gonna do the opposite of X," House Targaryen would be scratching their head trying to figure out what to do. Right? Even with dragons, it would be trouble for them if Hightower went against instead of with what they wanted.
And also, their House Targaryen's influence over all this is relatively new, whereas the Hightowers, even though their situation has changed, they have the faith, the Citadel. That's all been there for so long that a lot of it is just has much more history to it, and history that we're not talking about today, but certainly is relevant towards why the Hightowers who they are and why they have so much power. So, starting with Aegon the Conqueror, of course. Aegon, prior to the conquest, he is said to have visited Old Town and the Citadel prior to launching his conquest, as well as going to the Arbor. We surely wonder, did he go to the Citadel? Did he check out any books? Did he look for anything to do with his dreams, anything to corroborate them or more information? Possibly. I mean, it doesn't have to have been that at all. He quite possibly hadn't even had the dreams yet at this point. We don't exactly know when he visited Old Town. But it certainly is interesting, and it's even more interesting because Visenya was with him, and Visenya is, of the three, Rhaenys, Aegon, and Visenya, she seems to be the one by far the most associated with magic and the occult and things like that. Although we don't know if she had any dreams of her own. So the notion that Aegon had dreams actually makes two of them more tilted towards the supernatural, and we're less sure about Rhaenys. But anyway, it's just compelling to consider not just what interactions he would have had with these old books, even though it is, as we acknowledge, possible he didn't really care for that at all at this time. I'm guessing he did. But how he met the Hightowers. He would have visited them. They would have, feasted, hunted, hawked, whatever, how these nobles do their fancy activities. Gone on pleasure barges, sailed, on the honey wine. I don't know what they would have done, but I'm sure it was expensive. And they would have judged each other's character. A lot of these things are theater to draw out the character of each other and for them to make decisions about what kind of person they're dealing with here. But as well, you have the dragons. I don't think they took ship there. This is something that will come up later, I think. Given how the Hightowers behave when the war breaks out, I'm not convinced everyone knew what they were getting into when they've decided to stand up to Aegon. Some of them had probably never seen Balerion. And if they had, they might have thought twice about going up against him. And then his, and not let alone Meraxes and Vhagar. But we know for 99% certainty that the Lord of Oldtown had seen the dragons, and that may have been a big part of what came next and why they had nothing to do with fighting against the Targaryens during the conquest.
A couple thoughts. Aegon might have been pretty aware of the Hightowers even before he ever went there, right?
Oh, yeah.
They're still among the most couple prominent
surely
houses
part
in
of
the
why
land,
he went there, yeah,
right?
Yeah.
And also, even if they didn't see the dragons there, which I agree, they almost certainly did, but Old Town is probably more likely to have an understanding of the power of the dragons. The level of education and history that is centered there is greater than some random small town in the middle of the north. Like even Winterfell is so separated and not really a center of learning. They might not have had the same awareness of dragons that Old Town would have had.
Great point.
Whether they had seen them or not,
Also, he supposedly visited Lannisport. So if you look at the places he visited, there seems to be he went to visit the population centers. He went to Old Town and Lannisport on the West Coast. Those are the most prominent places. He also went to the Arbor, which is important, but that's a center of wealth. So it wasn't all about going to cities, but that's still kind of telling, especially since he founded King's Landing not that far into the future from there. So maybe he was trying to learn a few things about how cities are made or how they're laid out or just getting into all that stuff. There's a lot of possibilities. We definitely shouldn't limit ourselves to just a few possibilities as to what he was doing there. Probably just let your mind run wild. All the reasons he might want there to be there, to suss it out, to judge the leadership, to look at how cities are made, just all these things. The list could be that plus more quite easily. I imagine he had a lot of goals in mind.
I want to give him credit for where my logistical mind goes is things about a city, huge populations of people. Where does poop go? How do they get water there? These are things that you don't have to worry about with a village of 100 people. When you start talking about 100,000 people, those are issues that a good leader has got to anticipate. And there were probably some books in the Citadel that described how they designed the streets and the sewage system. And I would like to think that that's something, as much as he wanted to know about some prophecy or some magical sword, if he has some plan to build a city, I hope he really learned about the infrastructure that was required.
It's a great point. He could have just asked Lord Hightower, well, how do you do this? How do you manage this? How do you manage? He could just asked a bunch of questions about cities. And you would have wondered, the Lord Hightower, in response to these questions, is is this guy building a city or what's going on? Why does he, is he just curious? He would have been very piqued by those questions. I wonder what his mind is because and this leads us to another topic. I wonder if the Hightowers, this Lord Hightower, figured out that maybe this guy was going to make a move. He might have sussed it out that this Aegon fellow is awfully ambitious. He's very put together, he's smart and capable. Here's his badass sister with him. She's also smart and capable and dangerous. What are they thinking here? He's thinking about cities and stuff like that. He might have figured it out.
They're looking for knowledge. They're here, feeling us out as allies. Yeah.
A smart
I'm
enough
sure
Lord.
anyone, So start spinning ahead on where this might go, even if it's a small chance, it's a chance that's worth being prepared for.
Yeah.
You know?
So there's a lot of.
I had one other quick thought, by the way. The idea of them kind of sizing each other up. I think it's important to consider, even if they're sort of putting on a show, right? Putting their best foot forward. That still is something to judge, right?
Yes.
The things that you want to show off or try to hide, even if you see through it, it's still noteworthy what they feel like they need to be presenting. Someone like Balon Greyjoy, even when he puts his best foot forward, you can still tell he's a jerk. You know what I mean? You can still tell he's not really
you can't hide that,
your plan or what. Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be like Robert trying to hide his penchant for alcohol. You're like, no, there's no hiding that.
We can see what this guy's about. Yeah, they like Marjorie and Olenna kind of trying to question Sansa about what's going on. They kind of knew. They were really looking for confirmation. They knew Joffrey was a problem.
You're right. They were asked. Their questions were leading. Yeah, they had already. Yeah, you're right. They weren't looking for information.
And the things that Sansa didn't tell was giving him the answers they really wanted.
The fact that she didn't want to talk bad about Joffrey said everything. Yeah. Yes, you're totally right.
So you can imagine there'd be some of that. The things that Aegon or the Hightowers or whoever, even the things that they were sneaky or quiet about, is still telling.
Yeah, because these are people who have wielded immense power for so long. His dad taught him the proper ways not to screw it up and all these things, and going back, ad nauseum through prior generations. So yeah, I wonder too if Aegon was wondering if the Lord of the Hightower was out of touch or way up, because we hear that about the current Lord Hightower. That's an idea floated about him. It's not confirmed, but people say that he hasn't descended from the Hightower in 10 years, which is whoa, that's wild to think about. And it's what kind of effect does that have on your personality and your all your information comes from what people are telling you. And yeah,
or maybe some of your information comes from glass candles.
Ooh, yeah, that's true. They do have those in Old Town, so
you might not be quite as removed from what's going on as people think.
Good point. So either way, the Hightower is way up there, and whether that makes you more aloof or more paranoid or more worldly or some combination of the above. Anyway, it's going to have an effect on your character one way or the other. So the conquest. The histories tell us that Lord Manfred Hightower was the man in charge when the conquest began. This may have been the same lord that met Aegon and Visenya when they came through. We don't know when that was. We assume it wasn't a huge gap, but we also don't know when the previous Lord Hightower died. Now, we do have a good whole handle on who all the Lords Hightower were going forward until the reign of Jaehaerys, when there's more peace and less specificity there. But anyway, Manfred would have been present for Aegon's visit, even if he wasn't Lord. So he knew, he would have seen the dragon just like his father did, the dragons, because he would have been around 34 at least. This was the youngest Lord Manfred could have been when the conquest began, was 34. More likely he was in his 40s. So yeah, he would, either way, he would have the information his father had, or he was the one to collect it initially. Now, one of his younger sons, Lord Manfred, was already in the Warriors' Sons. And another of his sons was already a Septon. And he had at least 2 other sons, one named Adam and one named Garmin. He also had at least 3 daughters. And we're told he was a godly man. Now, we should always take Hightower history with a grain of salt, because these are history is written by the winners is a thing, or history is written by victors. Now, that's, you can't take that. There's more nuance to that saying than on the surface. But here, it's particularly true because these are powerful people. They're often the winners, and they literally control the people writing the history. So it's even more direct than it is in not just recent history. A lot of times a dynasty will write the history of something, and then the next dynasty will write a corrective thing, and maybe the truth lies somewhere between. But Hightowers have ruled the Citadel effectively or through influence for thousands of years. That's never really shifted away from them. So
it has been a break for someone else to cut through the bias or whatever. Yeah.
So one thing I wrote a note for myself when doing my research and reading for this episode was I doubt I'm going to find a lot of critical takes on House I'm having trouble saying that name. House Hightower in any of the histories, because they're all written at the Citadel. And I mean, that seems to be true. So we might have to just insert some criticism. Imagine that these guys and gals are probably, some negative things about them have probably been omitted. Probably. like if you were to write a top 10 list of houses most likely to receive positive source bias, Hightowers would probably be number 1, even more than the Targaryens. So, but still, it's believable that this Lord Hightower was godly, given his actions. Now, it's pretty easy and common, I think, for like a lord to make all the right noises and pretend to be faithful and all that stuff. But this guy seems to, I kind of get the sense this guy was genuine. But we'll see. Your mileage may vary. Let's go through it. Now, yeah, go ahead.
Can I say another thing here? Is it, given what we just said, right, that there would be certain biases in the history that's written and maintained, and it's been that way for thousands of years. There are some people who might, not just some people, most people probably just believe it.
Yeah, they do.
Right?
Yeah,
There's
absolutely.
not like, so if a Hightower child is born and raised and studies at Citadel, there's like, they're not necessarily being dishonest about the history. It's just what was taught to them their whole life and everyone else their whole life.
Mm-hmm.
Like whatever the truth is, it's not necessarily this evil bias of the Hightower side cover up the. See, it's just what everyone has learned and believes.
You're totally right.
It effectively just is truth.
It's a two-way street. The House, God, I really can't say it. House Hightower has a strong influence over the faith, but it's a two-way street. The faith is a strong influence over House Hightower. You're totally right. So I totally believe that some of these lords are very devout because that proximity to the faith. You're right. It's a two-way street. They live near the center of Westerosi worship of the faith of the Seven. So yeah, of course, it could rub off in a non-cynical way, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, the list of Hightower lords influenced by the High Septon would be massive. Like the High Septon would know where to go to influence. Like, well, we know who the powerful ones in this city are. And a lot of times the High Septon, maybe not a lot of times, but often there have been several cases where the High Septon literally is a Hightower. So, I mean, there you go. That, and not just Hightowers, but the most devout, who are the highest rank. They're like the archbishops, the equivalent, or the cardinals. And a lot of them are often Hightowers. So this is a little bit hazy because, as we know, High Septons aren't called by their original name, which I wonder if the Hightowers, it's just now occurring to me that maybe they're part of the reason that's done, that policy was implemented to hide how many Hightowers are in this organization. In fact, that would make a lot of sense. Yeah. I like that. Anyway.
And even aside from Hightowers, to hide whoever was in charge. Because some certain, like, I don't know, if they made a Blackwood the High Septon, there's some people who don't like the Blackwoods. And so like, he's not really a Blackwood. It's also not, it's like there's precedent for that in the real world too. The popes and kings often just change their name once they get that position.
So it looks like in the scenario we're dealing with right now, the beginning of the conquest, it looks like Manfred Hightower was one of those lords that was influenced by the High Septon rather than the other way around. Like, who had more power in this two-way street relationship? In this case, it looks like the High Septon had more power, although can't be certain. But here's the quote to kick us off on that.
When word of Aegon's landing first reached Oldtown, the High Septon had locked himself within the Starry Sept for 7 days and 7 nights, seeking after the guidance of the gods. He took no nourishment but bread and water, it was said, and spent all his waking hours in prayer, moving from one altar to the next. And on the 7th day, the crone had lifted her golden lamp to show him the path ahead. If Oldtown took up arms against Aegon the Dragon, His High Holiness saw the city would surely burn, and the Hightower and the Citadel and the Starry Sept would be cast down and destroyed. Manfred Hightower, Lord of Oldtown, was a cautious lord and godly. One of his younger sons served with the warrior sons, and another had only recently taken vows as a Septon. When the High Septon told him of the vision vouchsafed him by the crone, Lord Hightower determined that he would not oppose the conqueror by force of arms. Thus it was that no men from Oldtown burned on the field of fire, though the Hightowers were bannermen to the gardeners of Highgarden.
So it's awfully convenient. It happened. The vision came on the 7th day. The whole, 7 days, obviously, for the 7. So this This sounds very engineered, but I'm with it. I mean, you really shouldn't go out there and stand against the dragon. Like common sense says you would lose this battle/war. So, yeah, they needed a cover story. They needed an excuse, and this was it, right?
Yeah. I imagine that as much as that 7 days, it probably didn't take 7 hours for them to be like, all right, we're not trying to fight the dragons, right? No, of course not. Okay, well, like, how do we pitch this to the people? Mm-hmm. How do we deal with the Targaryens? How do we, they were probably planning details of what they knew right away was going to happen. That's what I expect.
Yeah. It's still, and because they have to go against their liege lords, like they have to not support the Gardeners who had ruled the Reach for a long time. And like with Garth the Gardener and Garth Greenhand, like all this, they really, as we've discussed in other episodes, there was little challenge to their rule. The Gardeners were just the pinnacle of Reach culture and heritage. And there was really no one else even close. So not backing them was a really big deal. Nina writes it as a crisis of faith. Like, not only is it the Gardener liege lord, but the Gardeners are practice this worship of the Seven for thousands of years, whereas Aegon hadn't yet, like, publicly converted to the faith. Or maybe he had sent missives out that he was going to, but until he knelt at the Starry Sept to receive a blessing of the High Septon, well, they didn't know he was going to do that. They didn't know he would have done that, so they couldn't have seen this coming specifically.
I mean, even if he had done that, you got to imagine there's still a little suspicion,
yeah,
right? Like,
absolutely.
Sure, he did that, but I mean, he just showed up, right? Like, yeah, they would still want to make plans. They'd have questions to ask. They know it's going to be a shift in everything, the way things have been. And it makes sense that they would want some time to send some ravens out, to ask some questions, to get their ducks in a row before this change comes.
And he has a responsibility to the people of Old Town too. I mean, yeah, he's like, well, I want to protect my house's power, but these two things are very tied together. Like, if Old Town falls, a lot of innocent people are going to die. It isn't just going to be, we all surrender and no one suffers. We just, no. Especially not according to the dream. According to the dream, the Starry Sept, Old Town, all of that would burn. So, yeah, so if they put that out there, that the High Septon had this dream, people will believe that. And they're like, yeah, well, you don't want to walk right into that. Sure, yeah, well, let's not fight the dragons. So, and given the way things went, like, the aftermath only justified their decision. The Field of Fire wiped out all the Gardeners. I mean, it was worse than they probably could have guessed. So they're like, well, that was a silver lining for them because they didn't have to face any sort of justice from the Gardeners saying, hey, why weren't you there? Why didn't you help us? You betrayed your liege lords. Well, now they skirted that issue entirely. And the Tyrells had been named Lords of Highgarden. So that's like, all right, well, yeah, we answer to them, if anyone. And the Tyrells are fully in Aegon's court. So they're not going to take action against the Hightowers for not supporting when they've already bent the knee. So that worked out as well as it could have, really.
Once again, it makes me wonder if that was something they were plotting through those 7 days. Like,
yes,
we got to make sure the Targaryens take out all the Hightowers. We got to make sure there's not an heir, there's no repercussion. Oh, Gardeners,
which
right,
Gardeners. I don't think they could have engineered for that. And they were like, what do we do? Like, if hopefully they bend the knee and there's no pushback against us. But yeah, it just worked out probably better than it could have because they couldn't have known all those Gardeners would get wiped out. Although Aegon may have intentionally been trying to wipe out all the Gardeners. That's something and
they might have sent letters to.
Yeah,
they might have sent letters to Highgarden to say, all the Gardeners need to mobilize. Make sure you guys are united front. Everyone needs to be on that battlefield to face these.
Yeah, through some intermediary. Like, it wouldn't just be from the Hightower. Yeah, but yeah, I like that. Yeah. So that's a pretty big deal to think about that. And Nina makes a similar point to you as well. Not just seeing the dragons, but having read the books about them and how devastating they are, which is these rest of these Reach Lords, the Gardeners, everyone else would not necessarily have deigned to read their histories, let alone, again, as we said, already not physically not having met the dragons in person, which alone is a way to change your mind. So House Tyrell, regarding them, while the Hightower in Old Town would remain a vassal of Highgarden, this is a point of pride. We've talked about that, how Aegon did this on purpose to kind of neutralize the Reach against him. They would be more concerned with infighting by appointing someone who had been the High Stewards above them all. They would wrangle and not like that and be like, those High Stewards are above us now. We're not happy about that. So the Hightowers would be amongst those lords, perhaps the most prominent amongst the lords, saying we don't We don't love this new state of affairs. But what are they going to do about it? They bent the knee to Aegon. The Field of Fire was lost. So, there's not much they can do in this case other than just go along with it.
I can imagine them being okay with it too. Like, you know what? We still have the Steppe. We still have the Citadel. We're still the biggest, richest city. Yes, you go. Yeah.
That's true.
Aren't you cute, Tyrell? You think you're in charge? That's nice. Yeah, you go ahead and do that.
You're right. That's a good point, because the Tyrells wouldn't be able to wield as much authority over them, even though they're the same rank technically as the Gardeners, without that prestige and history. Like, yeah, the Hightowers they can't summon as much help.
Won't be.
Yeah.
And they won't be called on as directly,
right? Yeah,
to send soldiers off to battle or whatever else the Targaryens want to do. Like, yeah, Tyrells, you go be their stooges. We're just gonna keep doing what we've been doing for thousands of years.
Not to mention the Tyrells / Highgarden was severely weakened after the Field of Fire. They just lost a lot of soldiers, so there's that too. So regardless of how Lord Manfred felt or what he thought he wanted to do, this is what he actually did. Quote,
Lord Manfred rode forth to greet Aegon the Dragon as he approached, and to offer up his sword, his city, and his oath. Some say that Lord Hightower also offered up the hand of his youngest daughter, which Aegon declined politely, lest it offend his 2 queens. 3 days later, in the Starry Sept, his High Holiness himself anointed Aegon with the 7 oils, placed a crown upon his head, and proclaimed him Aegon of House Targaryen, the first of his name, King of the Andals, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, Lord of the 7 Kingdoms, and Protector of the Realm.
I wonder what the 7 oils actually are. Like, what are each individual oil? There's like crone oil, stranger oil, maiden oil. What the hell?
Like it's CBD oil.
Yeah, I was thinking olive oil, peanut oil.
I don't know. Do they have
oil.
Peanuts in Westeros? I don't know. They do have olives. I don't know if they have peanuts.
They're missing out if
peanuts
not.
when they find the new world, I guess.
So that would have been an interesting 3 days. It says 3 days later in the Starry Sept, His High Holiness himself anointed Aegon. Like, what were they talking about in those 3 days? I'm sure it wasn't simply just, how many people do we invite for the coronation? Where does everyone stand? That would be part of it, because these, they care about these ceremonies and stuff. But there would have been other negotiations behind the scenes, certain concessions or requests or certain things that would need to be settled behind closed doors to make sure everything is smooth and to make sure, a lot of power is changing hands here. A lot is happening, and there would need to be assurances and diplomacy, just a lot of things going on.
Even things that aren't necessarily, cynical maneuvering for power. There would have been like legit concerns about like, this shipment of grain is going to this village. Yeah. These people will starve to death if it doesn't get there. Can you make sure, like we had to send troops here, or your dragons might be flying. Is this village safe? I can imagine. And times, 20 villages. I can imagine some very legit concerns of the people and logistics, even if behind that, they just want to make sure they can collect those taxes. Even if there's a cynical reason behind it, there probably were still a lot of maneuvering to maintain peace and safety of the people.
Yeah. Now, this marriage offer, highly interesting. I love how it said Aegon declined politely. Like, no, Aegon declined rudely. Like, get your daughter out of my face. No. But it's interesting to compare that towards, say, what happened with the Dance of the Dragons, where offending the 2 queens, you say. Imagine that. Upsetting both your queens and causing a civil war. Yeah. Aegon was smarter than Viserys and had better advisors, most likely. Nina points out that Aegon had a difficult position to navigate here, too. I mean, it would have been... You can see why Aegon might have wanted to accept taking a 3rd wife and been like, lock up House Hightower in his corner when he's trying to establish power over the entire realm. You can see why he might want a marriage alliance with House Hightower, even though, as he says here, apparently he doesn't want to offend his 2 queens. Like, his queens would understand if it was for power, I think. So maybe there's other reasoning going on here, but maybe not. Maybe they would be offended. I don't know.
And not to mention, as much as you might find an alliance with Old Town doing that, you might find a rival in Old Town doing that. Because then the faith is not going to be happy about a third of why 2 is bad enough.
Yeah, so. You're right. 2 is bad enough, and a third one, he can't say, I'm not allowed to have a third one. Like, that's obviously not true. It's like 2, but not 3. No, you're in a polygamous marriage. Like, and we know we have the Citadel here in our town. We know y'all have had more marriages than that. We know your history. So yeah, he might not have wanted to boost the Hightowers that high. He might want to have kept them at arm's length a bit. There's a lot of reasons why. Also, apparently there's a chance this didn't even happen, although I suspect it did. The way the Hightowers are and the way a lot of houses are, ambition is just a currency for them. It's so common that, of course, they're going to take their shot at marrying into the royal family. Well, couldn't hurt to ask. And no, it didn't hurt to ask. He declined politely. He probably expected it. He probably was completely unsurprised by the offer. He's like, yep, here it comes. Here comes the marriage offer. I've gotten lots of these. So that, of course, is a tried and true method of power and influence, is advantageous marriages. Now, you could argue that it's very desirable to marry into the Hightower family. There's plenty of other families that would jump at the chance. And, of course, the same is true for House Targaryen. Now, in this case, it's a matter of who benefits more from it. And I think Aegon decided that it would be more of a boon to the Hightowers than it would be to him and his family, and might be more worthwhile to keep these things open. We've also noticed how often it is that the Hightowers have large families. This is partly a factor of you can have larger families when you have absurd amounts of wealth. You can afford it. Kids are not cheap, in any timeline or setting, really. So in some ways, that's why there's so many of them. Recall that this Lord Manfred had at least 7 children minimum, and Lynesse, Jorah's ex-wife, was the 10th child of her siblings. She was the 10th, so it's crazy how many, so many kids, right? Now, jumping ahead just for a second, it's possible that Donald the Delayer, a lord we'll discuss in the next episode, Lord Hightower, is one of these other 7 children, or beyond 7, because he was born around 17 AC. And, so this is about halfway through Aegon's reign is AC 17. So, yeah.
You make me... I'm trying to compare Hightower to Frey, because they're also like a large family, but they seem to have diminished their value or their prestige, where the Hightowers do not have, or at least not as much have. Is it new for Frey to have a big family like that? Is that something Walder put into action, or have they always been that way?
They're younger as a house. Their house has only existed for about 600 years, so they don't have a huge long history. And yes, they were considered more upstarts early on. So like the first century was them just kind of getting bigger and spending, reinvesting their money into the castle. It used to just be a wooden bridge, and they made their money off the tolls. And over time, they spent the money to make it a stone bridge, and then the 2 wooden keeps on either side were stone casts. So they were reinvesting in themselves early on, and then eventually they became powerful and wealthy. And yeah, the Tyrells are a good example, though, as well. Song of Ice and Fire, they're maybe the second largest family that we know of in current times. The Freys are pretty clearly the largest in terms of like a lord with the most children. So it's another example of a house that uses sheer quantity of family members to gain power and standing. There's so many of them that can hold office. It has different... there's so many of them that you can put here and there. Like the Tyrells, they've got city, like old town. They got city watch captains and maesters, and they wanted to send the new master of coin up. And there's so many, right? And Cersei just like hates this. It bothers her. Whereas Tywin was just like, well, we just got to lean into it. And like, well, let's be allies with them and make this part of our strength, right?
Yeah.
He's like, we can't fight that. So let's make it ours. Like, it's better to do that. So maybe this is part of Aegon's thinking as well. But he had a different calculus than these houses that are not at the top. He's the new king with Balerion. He doesn't have the same considerations as Robb Stark, who needs to cross the river. So he's like, all right, I'll agree to a marriage. So yeah, Aegon wasn't forced into anything here. He had all the power in terms of violence and standing like that. So as well, let us recall, there's no King's Landing yet. Again, this keeps coming up. It's super important to consider. one very likely conversation that was held in Old Town while he was there is, so, where are you going to rule the kingdom from? Where's your capital? Are you going to rule from Dragonstone? Have you considered making your throne here in Old Town? Have you considered making the capital here? He probably had. He may have already decided not to. But this may have been when that decision was made. He may have heard them all out. He's like, okay, tell me your reasons for doing it here or doing it elsewhere. It might have been a really big deal, like people trying to argue for or against it. There might be some forces, some powers that be within, even maybe some of the Hightowers might have wanted it, some others may not. A lot of considerations. A new royal family, there's nothing like this has existed in Westeros before. It might be good for them to keep that power close to them, but they might not want that power to overshadow their own in their city. They might see themselves getting squeezed out. So I'm not sure which meant more to them, but it's a very huge consideration, regardless of where you fall with your guesses on what the Hightowers might have seen as a possible future here. Because you really could see it both ways, right? It's kind of a conundrum. Like, what would they have wanted? Would they have wanted the king to have his throne there, or would they not have? I'm not sure, but there's a lot of pros and cons. It's a pretty interesting decision.
I bet that the cons outweighed the pros. Even though there were a lot of pros, I bet the cons outweighed it. Basing that on a couple things, what actually happened. I think if they had really wanted it, if the pros had been strong enough, they would have made it happen.
Yeah.
And we would have heard more of a story of why it did or didn't.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And also just thinking about in the real world, for example, Washington, D.C. was just kind of carved out rather than, we kind of bounced the capital around like early American history, like Philadelphia and New York or whatever. But eventually they chose like sort of a neutral spot.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of negotiation around that. But I'm sure if it was better for New York to have been in New York, they would have made that happen. But they didn't. They're like, do it somewhere else. Let us keep our own thing going here. We don't want you to interfere or take from us.
Rather than one state having undue amount of power. Yeah, and they did. And that's a really good example. I wrote a video for In Deep Geek on why it's called the Seven Kingdoms, and I made a similar point. Like the Crown Land, Aegon created the Crown Lands, which is the royal fief for his lands, to taxes and soldiers and all that. And it was a new carve out. And it's kind of like DC. Washington, D.C. isn't part of any of the 50 states, nor is it a state itself. The Crown Lands isn't really a kingdom, but it is a carve out that isn't part of another kingdom. So it's kind of a similar thing in that sense. The Crown Lands is a lot larger relatively than Washington, D.C., but it's still, it works as a parallel there. So by the same token, if there's forces in Old Town, Hightowers and maybe other people arguing for the capital to be put there or not, there might be people from the Crown Lands that, in Aegon's entourage that are like arguing against that. They're like, no, you should build it back where close to your seat of power, Dragonstone. Do back up there. Like, that's where you should be. So there would be forces arguing for it to be near them as well. Like Duskendale and Rosby and places like that. They may have also had similar considerations. Like some people want it there, some people don't. Yeah, a little of column A, a little of column B.
You're going to ruffle a lot of people's feathers. A lot of people are going to feel like, why not us, right? You're going to make this one family, this one town very happy, assuming you even are actually making them happy.
Yeah.
And make 20 other houses jealous and frustrated.
Mm-hmm.
Or like, all right, like none of you. We're just going to make our own little spots.
Yeah, and that is what happened. And so that in the short term, you got to wonder what the Hightowers thought of that. In the long term, well, that's another huge population center for them to trade with. Might be a good thing. So
they can get ahead of it. They can get ahead of establishing trade routes and like send some carpenters over there.
Yes.
Let's make sure we're the ones building those buildings and setting up those trade
getting
routes.
That inside track. Yes, you're right. So they would see that opportunity, which is one of many of the possible opportunities. I mean, we got a new power structure being built. A new, entirely new Seven Kingdoms, and this house, the Hightowers, who were very practiced and experienced with wielding and holding power and gaining power, they would see the opportunities that come with a giant new power structure being built over everything. They would want to be a part of that. Speaking of the change in Westeros, a massive change that would be a huge boon for House Hightower, as along with most of the west coast of Westeros, would be the end of the old way. Aegon shut that down hardcore by invading them directly. Balerions, Flames had a bit to do with it. Lord Vicon Greyjoy was named new Lord of the Iron Isles. They had like a little lord's moot there. Aegon allowed them to choose, and they chose the Greyjoy. And he famously told his son, don't be stupid. Don't fight against the dragons. We're particularly vulnerable. We have ships. Those things burn, We really cannot go against them. Bravery cannot, you can't be brave enough. It's not going to matter. Like, bravery will not carry us here. So, as best as we know, this is something we covered in our episode on the Red Kraken in pre-dance era, which he's not going to be born for another 100 years or so. But that's when the old way returned under the dance, because these laws were no longer enforced. So shutting down the old way would have been huge for Western trade. Just no more piracy, except, there'd be a few holdouts that didn't obey the law. But this would be a giant change from like state-sanctioned piracy to the state made it illegal. Right? That's a huge difference for them. So, like, trade's going to flow. A lot more, like, smaller scale merchants could get going. They would not have to worry as much about having their ship stolen and their entire livelihood lost to a random pirate. Just massive change in the outlook for the city. So, that's something that pretty much everyone in Old Town would be thrilled about. It was assuming they realized it or assuming it was relevant to them, which to a lot of them it would be. And, of course, Lannisport, same deal for them. They're even closer to the Iron Islands. It might have mattered even more to them. Yeah. And the royal House Hoare dynasty that built Harrenhal and was ruled the Iron Islands before Aegon came, they were more concerned with land-based stuff than prior Ironborn, which you could say, then they probably didn't do as much raiding. No, that probably means that they didn't care. That probably meant that the Iron Islanders back home were let to do whatever they wanted, which, leave Ironborn to do what they want, and they will go raiding. So it's pretty simple, I think. So, and it's not just the implications in that region. This is a global impact on trade, right? It would be just ships from Essos would also be like, not as dangerous as it used to be over there. Like, the journey is still really far. Sailing south of Dorne is still a little bit perilous, but a massive difference in the outlook. And, if you're considering it as like, is this worth it? It might completely change it from not worth it to worth it. And the people in charge of the Hightower, Lord Manfred, his court, his entourage, his people, there's no way they didn't fail to notice this or see this coming. They would be aware of that change. Like, you shut down the Ironborn, did you? Hell yeah. That's great. So the rich get richer, but also some of the people who aren't rich got a little richer too.
One of the ways the rich are getting richer is through this increased stability, which also means the poor get richer and safer. Like
this is a rising tide lifts all boats kind of thing, pun intended.
Yeah.
Except for the Ironborn.
Yeah. Except for the ones with the boats. Yeah.
Except for the pirates.
Like, it seems to me that generally speaking, the people that were like more receptive to this were the people that depended on trade and or were thinking forward about the future and or actually cared about their people. Someone like the Ironborn are short-sighted and don't care about people, and they just want to take stuff now. But Old Town centered around trade, the Lannisport, like all these other people were like, we could either have this strife and this conflict and this destruction, or we could have security and stability and peace. And like it's almost like an easy decision, even without the dragon, there's a lot to be said. I mean, the dragon makes it more obvious, right? Or dragons make it more obvious. But even without that, it seems like in the long run, the more established and I'm going to say forward thinking or I want to say moral. That's not quite the right word I want to use, but like at the point where they're making decisions beyond like attack and don't starve, right? At the point where you're making decisions about how do we make our land better prepared for winter? How do we make our trade routes more safe with other entities? Those people are like, yeah, of course we're bending a knee.
Absolutely.
We put our pride and ego aside.
You're right. They would have seen the benefits. They were like, I could see how this would go badly for us, but the benefits are so strong. Like the negatives would really have to be bigger than we think they are for this not to be a windfall for them. And in terms of influence at court, so of course they would want to make sure things stayed favorable to them. They would want to be like, let's make sure tax policies, this and that. Maybe not a huge deal under Aegon's reign, because Aegon, his policy was to mostly let the individual regions carry on as they had before without codifying the laws. That eventually became a problem, and other kings had to deal with that, mostly Jaehaerys. But he dealt with it by not dealing with it. By like, let's let this transition be a little slower. We're not going to force all this change at once. Or maybe he just didn't see the benefit to it. Either way, his first small council didn't include any Hightowers that we know of. It's possible there were the Masters of Coin. His first 2 Masters of Coin are complete unknowns. So there's a chance there was a Hightower in there somewhere. Those super rich houses always seem to have the inside track on the Master of Coin job, although there's obviously exceptions like Littlefinger. But no Kingsguard that we know of either until Gerald Hightower, and that's way later, obviously, the White Bull. Queen Rhaenys did arrange the betrothal of one of the Tarth triplets. There was Tarth triplet girls born around this time, and one of those 3 married a Hightower son, which, again, there's so many Hightower kids, we don't know which Hightower kid this was. But that's something that the Iron Throne did a lot of early on, was do a lot of marriage brokering across kingdom lines that normally weren't done. Like, usually houses married within their own region because, well, these other regions were like separate countries to them, and there wasn't as much to be gained in alliances with houses that are halfway across the continent. Well, here, that's exactly what they were trying to make happen. The Iron Throne was doing that. So you wonder if they tried to involve themselves in any other Hightower marriages, and if there was any sort of logic behind Tarth specifically as another island holding on the other side of the continent. Maybe. There may have been some specific thinking here, or maybe they were just trying to make as many matches as they could from houses and that didn't share a kingdom. And Lord Manfred's fortunes, as good as all these things were. We talked about all these obvious benefits. We talked about why they probably engineered that vision, because it just all seems so engineered, because they, like you said, Sean, like the benefits to this arrangement are just so obvious. But they don't want to look like cowards, and they don't want to go against the faith. So, like, how do we do this just right? But they know what their end goal is. Bow to this new king and reap the rewards of it. And in long term, arguably they did. But in the short term, there were some big setbacks. What looked like the great path forward had some serious bumps in the road, and that road ran right through Dorne. Yeah. The invasion of Dorne began in 4 AC. 2 things of immediate interest come to mind here. One, having so many children. We talked about how that's an advantage when you're marrying. You can make so many marriage alliances. Occasionally it backfires because of entangling alliances, like what happens with, say, the Freys or some of these other cases. Or when your liege is like, it's time for war, and you have to send 10 children off to war, or 5, like you would rather not have so many children at war at once. 2, the issue of pride in the new Tyrell lordship. Like, you have this Lord Harlan Tyrell leading the Reach armies into Dorne. Would the Hightowers be, like, chafing under having their soldiers led by a Tyrell? Maybe not. Maybe I make too much out of that. But we do hear that there was chafing under Tyrell leadership, and the Hightowers are the most prestigious house in the Reach. Even more so than the Tyrells at this point. So if anyone's pride is ruffled, it's a good place to start is with the Hightowers.
You're more likely to have that chafing the more people are involved.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Some of it is going to depend on the personalities of the people involved or whatever.
Yes.
So if you have 2 sons and they're both like reasonable, even-keeled, educated, but if you have 7 sons and one of them is a loudmouth, arrogant,
yeah,
that guy's going to get his ruffles feathered.
His ruffles feathered, yes. So, and it didn't. If there was, ruffled pride ruffled here, then it would have gotten worse given how things went in Dorne. Like, they wouldn't have looked and like, well, he sure did a good job with losing the entire army in the desert, because that is what happened. This is that lord. This is the Scorpion canopy lord that was killed this way. So there were probably Hightower soldiers in this host. It was a large host, and I can't imagine the Hightowers didn't supply any of it. It was like 20,000-30,000 men. Like, none of them came from Old Town. That seems super unlikely. There's probably like officers and lesser lordlings in that host, and they all just, as we'll see shortly, they just all died. And this is also a host that struggled through the Prince's Pass. It was brutal and difficult. And then the desert itself, before getting to Hellholt, before everyone vanished in the desert. So it was bad before it got worse, and the Hightowers that were in that host would have suffered along with the rest. So what happens, of course, since the Dornish didn't fight back the way that Westerosi normally do, they engaged in guerrilla warfare and ambushes and all this stuff. Aegon decided, okay, we won. We went to Sunspear, no one stopped us, so that means we won, right? No, but for a while, that's what they told people. And of course, he appointed a variety of non-Dornish lords to rule Dorne. Apparently, none of them were Hightowers. Good for the Hightowers, because that obviously didn't go well. Like, all of them were murdered. So the Hightowers escaped that fate. So that phase of the war maybe wasn't too bad for the Hightowers. Maybe it was, because of the unnamed soldiers that we still know about. The second phase of the war was definitely terrible for House Hightower. During the progression of this war, another item of note is the creation of the position of Grand Maester. That position didn't exist before, of course. Why would it have? There was no central royal court. Of course, this is right up the Hightower's alley. They already have this huge influence over the Citadel. The Grand Maester is chosen by the Archmaesters. If you think that the Lord of the Hightower isn't going to, stick his finger in this voting process, well, I've got a bridge to sell you. I mean, certainly some of them probably didn't. Some of them probably didn't care. But if they wanted to influence the choice, they probably did, right? And they may have even came up with the idea of this position. We need a maester. A maester above the other maesters to advise the king. We've got one for all the lords. Someone had this idea. It may have come from the Hightowers. It maybe just came straight from the Citadel. That makes sense. But could have been a joint creation of the two,
Wherever the idea came from, and however genuine or unbiased different leaders would try to be, there would still be this passive influence coming through all of it, right? There still would be, the Old Town and the Citadel are still so tied together that even if someone else came up with the idea of someone from the Citadel should be the Grand Maester, and whoever's in charge of Old Town said, you guys decide, I don't want any part of it. That it still doesn't, there's still people in the Citadel that are going to be and have been their whole life influenced by Old Town.
Yeah.
So even people trying their best to be genuine and stay out of it and whatever's best, just do the right thing. There will still be this influence. And there's not everyone being purely step back, genuine, honest about it.
So I guess this would have happened around the same time. When Aegon declares victory over Dorne is around the same time that the position of Grand Maester was created. And that's also when Dorne erupted. It's basically when Aegon gets back to King's Landing, maybe meets his new Grand Maester. Just as that's happening, Dorne rises up, murders all the people appointed to rule over them, and kicks out / murders the garrisons put to rule over them. That's when Lord Tyrell moved out of the Hellholt. His army vanishes. And then 4 or 5 more years later, this is going to have consequences because the Hellholt is going to be the site of more failure for the Iron Throne. In 10 AC, Lord Fowler emerged from the Prince's Pass to attack Nightsong, the Castle Nightsong, and captured it. Lord Manfred, Hightower Lord, is kind of far from Nightsong, but not so far that he apparently had some responsibility here. He dispatched his heir, Sir Adam, with a large army to retake it. And it was a huge failure. By the time Sir Adam arrived with his army, the castle had already been burned, all the nobles had been taken hostage, and Lord Fowler had returned to Dorne already. He was already back through the Prince's Pass. Meanwhile, this appeared to be maybe a feint or an arranged maneuver, because as these troops were drawn off to Nightsong, Sir Joffrey Dane emerges from the Red Mountains, presumably from some secret passes, because it's not the Prince's Pass or the Boneway. There must be some way. There's a lot of mountains between Starfall and Old Town, but there's got to be some ways through. And if you're a local, you might know the ways. They might have. Shay's got the map up. If you're watching on video or watching the video elsewhere, or looking at the map yourself, you can see there's no obvious way through, but there is a way through, clearly, because that's what happened here. So they pillaged the surrounding towns and farms. They didn't have enough manpower to take Old Town itself, which is not surprising. Old Town is a severe and large place, and this is an army that emerged from the mountains, so it's not a giant host. But Lord Manfred had to do something. He couldn't just allow this host to run around and destroy the countryside. So he dispatched one of his other sons. This was Garmin, and Garmin went to confront Sir Joffrey. But remember, most of the army of Old Town was away at Night Song. So Sir Joffrey Dane did not turn and run. Instead, he faced the Hightower sortie. Quote,
Old Town's walls proved too strong for the Dornish to overcome, but Dane burned fields, farms, and villages for 20 leagues around the city and slew Lord Hightower's younger son, Garmin, when the boy led a sortie against him.
So apparently Joffrey slew Garmin personally, which, I mean, that's pretty nasty. So this is just when they thought they were done with raiding, right? The Ironborn are cut off from raiding them, but here come the Dornish, but the Dornish in this case were provoked by the same people they just bent the knee to. So I'm not saying Joffrey's a good guy here for burning the farms and villages of innocent people, but the Seven Kingdoms are the aggressors here, pretty clearly, right? As for Sir Adam, he didn't do the dumb thing. He didn't run into Dorne with his army trying to recover these hostages and punish this army. That would have been pretty foolish. He tried to run back to Old Town to try to confront Sir Joffrey, who had just killed his brother, because he got news of that. Like, a rider ran up the road and told him about this, and he moved quickly to run back to Old Town. But of course, Joffrey knew. Again, this was probably planned. They knew the army had been drawn away to Night Song, and this was enabled Joffrey to make his move. So once the larger force is moving back to Old Town, well, Joffrey's like, okay, now it's time to get the hell out of here through our secret mountain passes. And yeah, so spies and scouting and planning really worked for the Dornish here. They really fooled the Hightowers and got them to move their men away and attacked while they were weak. And yeah, they got owned. They got really outthought here, outmaneuvered badly. And this
intelligence, the value of battlefield intelligence.
Right. Now, it may just be a coincidence, but maybe Lord Manfred felt responsible, felt the loss of his son. He may have thought like his decision-making was the reason for that. Maybe his son wasn't ready for this responsibility. Maybe he felt guilty. Who knows? Either way, he died within the year. So it may have just been completely unrelated. But yeah, this couldn't have helped his outlook, his disposition, his stress level, etc. So Adam, who had run a wild goose chase trying to chase down Dornish raiders, became the new Lord of the Hightower. And Old Town was presumably angry for revenge against the Dornish, particularly Starfall. Even though Dorne wasn't the aggressor, they kind of were in this sub-theater of the war, because they did invade, kind of a counter-invasion, you could call it. And they did get it. They got their revenge not directly, not by their own hand, but Visenya brought Vhagar to Starfall and gave it a good baking. Wasn't as vicious as Balerion burning Harrenhal, because Vhagar's flames don't burn as hot. It didn't melt the castle. But that happened. So, in a sense, Nina writes, that's really important. It's really important. The feudal relationship, the overlord and vassal connection. Well, you're supposed to punish the people that attacked you. Your feudal lord is supposed to, you hand over the keys to violence to them. They're allowed to do that. They're supposed to be the ones that handle justice and things like this. So burning Starfall might have seemed like sufficient payback for what had happened to them. But things only got worse on the revenge side for the Targaryens, because Meraxes was shot down over the Hellholt, the site that the Tyrells had on lockdown for a little while there. And of course, Rhaenys went down with Meraxes, and they were never heard of again. No word on if Sir Joffrey was ever killed, or if he lived out his life normally, or what happened. So he may have gotten away with it. It's an outside possibility. He was a Sword of the Morning, but you kind of think that would have been mentioned. The reason I bring this up, even though it's not really related to Hightower stuff, is you would like, this guy burned villages and stuff. How could he be Sword of the Morning? Come on, y'all. You got to be a little more cynical. Human beings vote for who the Sword of the Morning is. And human beings can do all sorts of stuff, like they don't have to have, and they can be coerced into choosing this guy. He could have, I think we're going to see that in A Song of Ice and Fire. I think we're going to see Darkstar seize Dawn and be like, yep, I'm Sword of the Morning, and what are you going to do about it,
The Kingsguard ostensibly are
perfect
honorable and knightly, and yet we know they are not, consistently are not.
We have literally an undead monsters in the Kingsguard now. I mean, how come on.
Maybe Joffrey was a undead monster.
Yeah. Sure, yeah, it's possible, right? Yeah. So, regardless of whether Lord Adam felt like that was sufficient vengeance for his brother or not, we don't know, or just if enough had been done to Dorne. I mean, Dorne was messed up by all the burnings of the dragons, so it's hard to say that they weren't sufficiently punished, but you never know. Again, humans have a large capacity for revenge. Either way, the war ended 3 years later when Aegon just gave up the war after getting that mysterious letter that caused him to say, all right. He got real frustrated, flew back to Dragonstone, came back, and was like, all right, no more war. No Hightowers are mentioned at court when that happened. Still, this is, whether they wanted revenge or not, or whether they felt satisfied, this is the quote that describes that moment.
The Dornish victory, if victory it was seen to be dishonorable, and the survivors of the fight, and the sons and brothers of those who had fallen, promised one another that another day would come, and with it, a reckoning. Their vengeance would need to wait for a future generation, and the accession of a younger, more bloodthirsty king. Though he would sit the Iron Throne for another 24 years, the Dornish conflict was Aegon the Conqueror's last war.
So whether or not they got enough vengeance, they certainly got extended peace, and that's pretty valuable, especially in this new nearly raid-free environment. No Dornish raids, no Ironborn raids, nothing, at least nothing on a large scale. Surely there were some exceptions here and there, but nothing that would cause policy changes or anything like that. So at this phase, if we jump forward to the year 25, this is when we know King's Landing was growing fast. It was already the third largest city by this point. So still Old Town was larger. By this point, Old Town could probably see the writing on the wall and was like, this King's Landing is going to surpass us. Whether that bothered them or not, like it's probably not a big deal. Like it's a small point of pride maybe. I doubt it was a huge problem. A bigger city, to them that might be even a benefit. Like we talked about earlier, that might just be more trade. That might actually be good for them. I'm not an expert on this sort of thing, but I think it's a good thing, even though some pride may have been involved. Ultimately, it's probably good for them.
I also feel like a city as old and wealthy and educated as them might recognize that we're at capacity. Like we don't necessarily have the land or food for more people. A good job if you can make more, but we're at capacity.
We are at capacity. Yep. So Lord Adam had 2 children of note, perhaps only 2 children total, though we don't even know who he married. So there's just some unknowns here. A few. These 2 kids that we do know of are very interesting, though. The elder was Patrice Hightower, and she has a lot in common with a current member of House Hightower, that is Melora, who is called Melora the Mad Maid. What they have in common is both being the eldest, although I'm not sure if Melora is the eldest or just the eldest daughter. Patrice is actually the eldest. And they're both rumored to be involved in sorcery. They're both maidens, which only enhances their reputation as using magic because of all these superstitions that you have to be a virgin to practice magic, which is a tradition rooted in some real-world superstitions. And Melora is supposedly helping her father research books and spells to deal with these Ironborn raids. So Patrice wouldn't have had that issue since the Ironborn had stopped. But all these things they have in common. The son that Adam had was another Manfred, so he named his son after his father, and that Manfred also became Lord. He was the next Lord after Adam, but we aren't quite there yet. It's possible this Manfred was the one who married the Tarth triplet, though. Certainly don't have a lot of possibilities there. Manfred had the second Lord Manfred had sons Martin and Morgan, as well as a daughter named Cerise. Cerise might ring a bell because she is pretty famous. You'll see why in a moment if you don't already know. And again, probably some other unnamed children. These Hightowers, as fertile as they are, but they don't all make the history books. There were 7 different High Septons during Aegon's 36 to 37-year reign. All of them apparently stayed on good terms with him, which likely benefited the Hightowers and may have been in part because of the Hightowers. They may have been like, get along with him. Just, we need you to get along with the king. You can see why it would be good for us. Like, don't be too religious. don't.
They might have
You're a High Septon.
People they knew would get along with him in the first place. Yeah. Coach them on how to get along with him once they're in position. How are Septons a position for life? Did all 7 of them die and get replaced, or was there some other process?
Yeah, they are. It's like the Pope or whatever, where it's a position you hold till you die, like Kingsguard or something like that. Although there's probably been a few exceptions where someone got booted. I can't think of any. I mean, for the Kingsguard, I can think of the one example, but I can't think of any examples of a High Septon being booted before his time, except also in A Song of Ice and Fire when the High Sparrows people just like interrupted the choosing. So maybe even technically the new High Septon hadn't been chosen yet. So that's neither here nor there.
It just seems like that's a lot to die in that span of time.
Well, they're usually old in the first place because it's usually like, right. But still, you're right.
Maybe they're picking older people. But I also wonder if maybe some of them weren't playing ball and got some poison in their wine or whatever.
It's possible, but it says there was no animosity between them. So but that could have been covered up. They may have just been poisoned quickly. But they're also chosen by vote. It's not like they're just like the oldest guy gets nominated. So the voting process, they would have been concerned with that pleasing the king before choosing him, not after. Now, there's always the chance of you elect someone that says all the right things and then they completely flip on you and do with it. Like, we've all seen that happen in the real world. We've all seen politicians break like all their promises.
Only Nixon could go to China.
Yeah. So, that's we got to keep that in mind. A healthy dose of cynicism always comes in handy here. Always seems appropriate. So now, one of those High Septons did object, though. It wasn't like it was all smooth sailing entirely. They stayed on good terms, but it wasn't like they didn't have conflict. One of them objected to the notion of Maegor marrying Rhaena. Now, remember, Maegor, uncle of Rhaena. Maegor didn't have any living children of his own, but his older brother Aenys had plenty of kids. So what does the High Septon say? He says, we object to Rhaena marrying Maegor. We're against incest. Why not marry my niece instead? My niece, Cerise Hightower. And this was accepted. They were like, yes, okay, let's do that. So this kind of shows that Aegon was like, he was interested in a Hightower marriage, but not to himself. So he's like, yeah, let's do that. So he married he had the Hightower marriage to the junior branch of his family, because Aenys' branch was the one that was going to inherit the throne, or so he thought. Well, Aenys' branch did inherit,
ostensibly,
but his kids didn't. So that's super interesting because that's whoever Lord Manfred married. We don't know who his wife was. It's the same house that this High Septon came from, because that's Cerise is his niece. So we can make that connection. So they got their connection to the royal family. It wasn't through the main line, but it still was a big deal. Maegor wasn't in the line of succession, but he was eventually hand to the king to Aenys. So there's a lot of, he was a great warrior, one of the finest knights in the realm. And Cerise married Maegor. She was 23 and he was 13. That's important, not because of the age gap, although that's relevant, but because people didn't know what Maegor was yet. They didn't know what they were dealing with. The full, his inner psychopath hadn't fully manifested yet. There were the red flags, but those were mostly kept under wraps. Like, people didn't necessarily know that he'd already, killed a horse and nearly killed a stable boy that, screamed at him, or just in shock and horror. Yeah, so, they didn't know what they were dealing with yet. And, that didn't turn out to be so great, tying yourself to Maegor. So, yeah. Now, Maegor boasted of his many attempts to make an heir on Cerise. They never had a child. And this was a big problem for him because he thought of it as a manly thing to have kids, like a lot of Westerosi men do. They're like, you're not man enough to have kids. And he didn't have kids with Cerise. Meanwhile, his brother, Aenys, who by a lot of measures was not manly at all, according to people like Maegor. He had 5 kids by, just kept popping more kids out. So, like, by that measure, his brother was far manlier than him. And, And there was actually a 6th child that died as an infant. So, there's that too. So let's move on to Aenys, in fact. Aenys, like his father, he was crowned in the Starry Sept. And a number of revolts happened, like, soon after Aegon's death, in part because, well, Aegon was strong and powerful and no one wanted to rebel against him, but Aenys was seen as a lot softer and weaker, so people thought maybe they could get over on him, whereas they couldn't on Aegon. But most of these aren't terribly relevant to House Hightower. The Vulture King maybe had been, because that's sort of in their sphere, but maybe not a big deal. They may have been worried, though, if the Vulture King is going to emerge and savage other parts of the region, they might have been worried about something happening, another army like Joffrey Dane's emerging from the east and causing problems. So they might have been wary of that. They also would have been maybe wary about what was happening in the Iron Isles, because after the latest Ironborn rebellion was put down, Aenys offered them a boon. And the boon they asked for was to kick all the Septons and Septas out of the Iron Islands. And Aenys is like, oh, well, I guess I have to accept that. That might have made them nervous about the Ironborn starting their raiding ways again. It didn't, apparently, but it did bring them closer to that point again. And they might have been worried. They're like, okay, well, we're tied to Maegor, and we get this weak King Aenys. You wonder if they thought maybe Maegor would have been a better king too. Now, of course, that is what happened. But you wonder if did they do anything to maybe make that happen, or did they tell Maegor they'd help, or was there any sort of back and forth prior to these next set of events? Because Maegor was a problem. Like, you don't just say, yeah, you look at him and say he's stronger than Aenys, but that doesn't mean you look at him and say, oh, he's our ticket. Because he obviously became very problematic over time, very murderous, and not to mention not having children, which puts the stability of his line in question. So we're jumping forward to the year 39, where Maegor is now at this point hand of the king to Aenys. He declared Cerise barren and took Alice Haraway to wife. If he's like, well, my father had a polygamous marriage, why can't I do it? And Visenya backed him in this. Visenya was like, yeah, you go right ahead, do it, son. But obviously the faith was like, no. And House Hightower's like, no, that's our daughter / sister. You can't do that to her. This is embarrassing. Like, you're embarrassing our whole house. Like, think of that. You just set his wife aside and declares her barren. Pretty embarrassing, right? So the High Septon demanded Maegor return to Cerise. And yeah, go ahead.
I want to clarify, it's worth noting that there is, I mean, it can't compete with dragons, but the Faith has like a military arm.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
At this time,
They do.
It's not a complete hollow statement for the High Septon to say, I don't want X. He can say, I'm going to send troops if you do X.
Yes.
Right?
He didn't, because he didn't want to have it come to that, but he was trying to use social / religious pressure rather than the threat of violence, because the threat of violence wouldn't benefit them. It wouldn't probably work for them. They didn't want to take on the dragons. Although they could skirt that line with Aenys on the throne, because Aenys was unlikely to bring things to a head. Maegor, obviously a different matter. If Maegor had been king at this point, they might have done things differently. Or not, because this High Septon didn't back down.
Yeah.
So let's move on here. So he demands that Maegor return to Cerise and re-accept her as his lawful wedded wife and bring her back to his household. But he also went so far as to call Alice Haraway, who he had married as a second wife, he went and called her the whore of Haraway. I was like, that's pretty harsh. Like, it's not her fault. Lord Manfred was also loudly against the polygamy too. Unsurprisingly, I mean, Cerise was his daughter, so he would not have taken kindly to all the insults and the fraying of this connection to the royal house as well. So he and the High Septon were together on this. They were united on it. Maegor, Aenys pushed back on his brother and was like, you have to take Cerise back, and set aside your second wife or face the consequences of exile. And Maegor's like, all right, exile. He went, packed up and went to Pentos. And Maegor obviously had to abandon his post as Hand of the King. And Aenys appointed Septon Murmison in his place. Septon Murmison was a creepy old weirdo who said he could fix Cerise's fertility by laying his hands upon her. Laying his hands upon her to fix her for, like, that is some real creepy stuff right there, right? And Cerise got tired of it and left. She's like, I'm not going through these quote-unquote fertility treatments anymore. I'm going back to Old Town. Leave me alone, you creepy weirdo. Like, a side anecdote time, folks. When I first moved to Atlanta, I got a hold of this magazine that's only distributed to people that go to strip clubs and people who attend, like, adult entertainment. And this magazine is full of entertaining hilarity.
You certainly didn't find it at a
Oh, no, of
strip
course, because
club.
I
No.
wasn't at a strip club. No, 21-year-old me would never have gone to a strip club.
No,
Never. Not in Atlanta, the capital of strip clubs. No. But so in this magazine was this man with his hands like this, like he's getting ready to grab something, and he's like, his pitch was, he, through his massage techniques, he will make your breasts larger. He was trying to get women to pay him to fondle them. Like, what the hell, man? So this is what I think
What's
of
his
with
number?
Septon Murmison. Yeah, it says, what's his number? Where? That's horrible. Where is he? Where is this man?
Is this man?
How do I find him? So I can complain. No. So, anyway, but this problem was inflamed even further by Maegor because, rather worse than what Maegor had done, because Aenys is like, yeah, the Faith is mad at us. They were mad at what Maegor did, so I know, I will just marry my son to my daughter. That won't make things worse, will it? So, of course, that was a huge problem. The High Septon went volcanic on that and was like, what the hell? You know, this is an abomination, blah, blah, blah. He said all the things he said before, but louder and more forceful. And Aenys, again, because he's kind of a softie, was unwilling to threaten them or say, shut up or I'll burn the Starry Sept, which is what Visenya told him to do and what Maegor would have told him to do had he been there. And Nina's like, yeah, just, her notes are like, yeah, shaking your head here. What are you doing, Aenys? So, like, Aegon's marriage was accepted by the Faith because it already happened. It was already there before the conquest. So they didn't have a say in that one. They weren't going to be like, you have to divorce your queens. They're like, yeah, that wasn't going to happen. They didn't try that. But this, before it happens, like, they announced the intention of this. It hasn't actually happened yet. They're like, so of course they speak up and say, are you kidding me? Didn't you accept our religion? This is so against our religion. Remember, the doctrine of exceptionalism hadn't been written yet. That's a thing that happened under Jaehaerys. So this was completely out of nowhere and crazy that Aenys would think it was accepted. You wonder if Visenya was just like egging him on, like, yeah, don't listen to them, just do it, you know, because that seems to be Visenya's definitely the angel on the shoulder that's choosing violence. Like, if you've got, I don't know if he had anyone on his left shoulder saying, no, don't do that. Just the voice of not irrationality and the other non-voice that doesn't exist at all, you know?
I can imagine Aenys or Visenya feeling like it's out of nowhere for the Sept to tell me who I can marry.
Yeah,
you know,
I agree. I mean, Visenya would not have. That tends to be her attitude. Like, you can't tell us what to do. You have no say at all. Like, how dare you even suggest you have a say in this? Like, that feels like her attitude.
Accepting your religion and following the rules of your religion's leader are different.
Yes,
we've got dragons, buddy.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Visenya is so awesome. I love Visenya. she's a maker of fun events. And anyway, so in the year 41, all these problems came to a full-on head. The Faith uprising became kind of official at this point. Like, it was already burbling. Like, obviously the High Septon's been complaining for a while. And super relevant to the Hightowers because the commander of the Warrior Sons chapter in Old Town was Morgan Hightower. And that's the son of Manfred. And Manfred dies shortly after this, was succeeded by his eldest son, Martin. Martin would face an entirely different problem, because while Aenys is not a violent man, Aenys wouldn't be around much longer, and Martin would have to deal with Maegor the Cruel as king instead of this dude in exile. So about a year later, as the early stages of the uprising continued to progress, and Aenys was just like, I don't know what to do. He throws his hands up in his air like, call a council to deal with these problems. Wait, don't call a council to deal with these. Wait, send you. He just effed it up pretty bad. And he died after having some health issues in the care of Visenya, so it's pretty sketchy, but that's a whole nother story. And that's our stopping point for halfway through the episode.
Can I ask a quick question?
Absolutely.
That so Martin and Morgan were brothers?
Yes. Manfred was their father, yeah.
Is Martin the older brother?
Yes. Yeah.
Say he died, would it have then gone to Morgan? Is Morgan given up his rights to be in the faith or whatever?
It depends on. Probably not, because by that time Martin probably already had his own children. But if not, yes,
Okay.
yes, and Morgan would have had to either been passed over for a son that hadn't committed, or would have had to have left the Warrior Sons. But the Warrior Sons wasn't like a lifetime commitment, I don't think, in this era. So I don't think it's like the King's Guard or something like that. So I think that would have been accepted, especially for such a rich house. They could have gotten around any sort of consequence for that. Like, let's little leverage, use our, let's settle this our way. Anyway, so that's a lot. That's a very active part of the first reign. We covered Aegon and Aenys. In the second half of this episode, we're going to get to Maegor covers even more time. So I just want to say, y'all, we're only a few weeks away from Fire and Blood reread us. And in that time, as I've been saying the last several weeks, it's the time is dwindling for you to get in on our $2 a month price for Patreon, because that price is going away. Those of you who already have it will get to keep it. So if you get in now, you can keep that $2 price even after it goes up for good. And that one of the reasons it's going up is because we've been continually adding to our patron content, and over the years, well, it seems to be more valuable. There's more bonus episodes you get now than you used to, including the most recent one, Mantaris, City of Monsters, scripted content. That one is for patrons and subscribers only, so check that out or sign up today, and you can get access to that episode as well as all the other bonus episodes, like the Red Kraken, like Gagassos, like the Where Are They Nows, like some other ones. I can't remember them all.
Can I share a funny anecdote about the creation of Mantaris?
Absolutely.
It just cracked me up. When we were making that episode, I had Sean do the quotes for it because I did the editing and I didn't really want to listen to myself do the quotes. So I had Sean do the quotes, and there were 8 quotes originally, and he sent me an email with the quotes. And then we said, oh, sorry, we added a 9th quote that you don't have. Can you send us that one too? And well, I got an email from Sean that said, Mantaris, now with the shocking 9th quote. You won't believe it. Really
you won't believe.
Now with the shocking, so subscribe to hear what the shocking 9th quote is. It quite amused me.
Also, want to make sure people know about our monthly Patreon hangouts that we've started doing recently. We have gaming and other fun activities for any of you who are interested. And the next one is July 27th, 9 p.m. If you're hearing this after the fact, join our Discord or our Facebook group to keep updated on when those times are. Also, thanks to Davey Mack, who sends a super chat and says, thanks, History of Westeros, for your great content. Well, we appreciate that, Davey. We will keep it coming. And Jenny P says, I know this is a tad off topic, but just popping in to say I've been rereading and listening to the Valar Readus. So good. Love your content. Well, thank you, Jenny P. And we're happy to be getting back to Valar Readus pretty soon for Fire and Blood. It's a long way out, but we will redo the entirety of Valar Readus one day. And that day will come after the Winds of Winter. So it'll be a good time to do the whole reread us once we have a whole new book to consider in light of the previous 5. And we'll see when that is. Who knows? Okay, Maegor. Wow, the reign of Maegor, though relatively short, was extremely active for House Hightower and launched events that would continue after his reign. The dual problems of Maegor the Cruel and the Faith Militant became one big combined problem as the two factions embarked on a bloody campaign against one another. The Hightowers were caught in the middle. On one side, Cerise was married to Maegor. On the other side, they were estranged, and they had a long association with the Faith, and thus some elements of the Faith Militant. It's not clear especially at this era, where the faith begins and where the faith militant begins. Like, how much overlap? It wasn't as well-defined thing because, well, it's not like people are out there wearing their allegiance badges and like they're carrying around a flag to say which side they're on, right? No, of course not. In fact, the faith militant practiced a lot of subterfuge because Maegor started hunting them down. So they had to keep hidden for reasons of just basic strategy. Now, again, Martin's brother, Lord Martin Hightower, his brother was Sir Morgan, commander of the Old Town Warriors' Sons. That's really important. So the faith militant would be even closer to orders like this. The ones who were already kind of violent and maybe more willing to get bloody in defense of their beliefs. The swords and stars were everywhere. The swords are basically is the short nickname for the warrior sons, and the stars were nicknamed for the poor fellows, who are the two sort of categories within the faith militant. Remember, the swords are usually the ones that came from decent families, meaning moneyed families, not decent like in their behavior, of course. And the poor fellows are more of like the common born members of that organization. So before and after Maegor claimed the crown, Cerise continued to put it out there that she was his only true wife. Like, this is not a quiet, mousy individual who just like took what happened to her lying down. No, she was outspoken about the scenario that she was faced with. She was like, nope, I'm his one wife. That's it. Like, I'm married under the eyes of gods and men. That's the only one that counts. This second marriage is completely invalid. Which, by the way, is an interesting argument to put forward. Like, is a second marriage valid or not? That might become relevant in A Song of Ice and Fire. Maybe not, but maybe it will be. So, and this is true. This continued even after Maegor took it even farther, because when he came back from exile, he had a third wife. He married Tiana of Pentos. He's like, well, what's better than 2 wives? 3. Of course, eventually it would be 6, but that's not even in this episode. We're not even going to get that far. Grand Maester Myros even told his king, he's like, your true wife is Cerise Hightower. Grand Maester, keep in mind, influenced maybe by the Hightower, but Maegor killed him. So he's like, yeah, okay. It said that Maegor listened to him, let him say everything he was going to say, then killed him. It's just like, yike, okay then. But the High Septon, that didn't stop the High Septon. He kept condemning the polygamous marriages. It's not clear that Lord Martin did, though. Martin's father, Manfred, did. Manfred was out there complaining, but Martin didn't. We don't know that he did. And there's a reason why he might not have, and that's because Manfred was complaining to Aenys. Martin, if he's complaining, it's to Maegor, and Maegor just like killed the Grand Maester. And Maegor killed 3 of his Grand Maesters throughout his reign. So, perilous position to be in, apparently. Any proximity to Maegor is perilous, I suppose. And so that's fair for Martin to approach things differently than his father had. There was really no danger of Aenys going ultra-violent, but Maegor, it's like, yeah, like, drop of a hat, this guy could do that. But yeah, again, the difficulty, it's like a tightrope walk. Like, Maegor is getting increasingly bloody and brutal. Like, how does the Hightower stand on this issue of, like, the faith being persecuted, but also the faith, like, breaking laws? Like, some of what the faith militant stood for was just pure zealotry, but some of it was, yeah, some of them are criminals, but some of them are, like, have the right of it. This is a very gray scenario. There's not a lot of good guys here. Although I think you could make a case that Maegor was worse. But that's not really our job today. We're not really here to discuss that. But from the Hightower perspective, they're like, well, what do we do? Like, we're tied to Maegor because of this marriage, but even that isn't really working out right now. Like, he's estranged from her, but do we even want to fix that? Like, Cerise does, but is that really what we want? Maybe we want to, like, cut the cord here, let this guy go down in flames, but at this point, maybe it wasn't clear that he would. It wasn't clear that, like, Maegor's reign self-destructed over time, right? He just lost so many of the lords that eventually it all just fell apart for him. But this is so early in his reign. That had not happened yet. He had not lost anything at this point. Everyone was afraid of him. Even the half of the family that he had usurped, they just took it. At this point, they hadn't made any move yet. They were still just like, yeah, all right, Maegor's the king. And Maegor was content to just let that lie. He didn't go pursue his nephew to murder him to make sure nothing happened. He seemed just confident that no one would move against him. And you can see why. The guy was terrifying, and he had Balerion. So, like, and Visenya was still alive too, because a lot of what went wrong for Maegor happened after Visenya's death. So, what a weird spot for the Hightowers to be in. Like, do we want to be in this arrangement? Do we want to make the most of it? Do we want to find our way out of it? Like, I have no idea how they would have viewed it. So much depends on the personality of Lord Martin, which is a complete mystery to us. But he couldn't have just been like, la-di-da, it's fine. That much I think is pretty safe. And things came to a head, though. In 43 AC, Maegor and Visenya and Balerion, I wrote in my notes, Maegor and Visenya and Maegor. Yeah, 2 Maegors came to Old Town. Oh, God, 2 Maegors. That's terrible.
Maybe it's a double negative. Maybe it would have canceled out.
Maegor the Cruel and Maegor the Nice. Maegor the
Maegor the Cool.
Maegor the Cool, yeah. So he it's not like why is Maegor coming? No, he had the intent of incinerating the Starry Sept. He kind of said he would do that, I guess, or that's what the expectation was. Here's the quote anyway.
As pillars of smoke rose all through the Westerlands and the Riverlands, Vhagar and Balerion turned south. Another Lord Hightower, counseled by another High Septon, had opened the gates of Old Town during the conquest, but now it seemed as if the greatest and most populous city in Westeros must surely burn. Thousands fled Old Town that night, streaming from the city gates or taking ship for distant ports. Thousands more took to the streets in drunken revelry. This is a night for song and sin and drink, men told one another, for come tomorrow the virtuous and the vile burn together. Others gathered in septs and temples and ancient woods to pray they might be spared. In the Starry Sept, the High Septon railed and thundered, calling down wrath of the gods upon the Targaryens.
So this is a very different scenario. It says that another High Septon and another Lord of Old Town, surrendered to the dragons. But this Lord Hightower, it will remain a mystery what he really thought. But this High Septon did not play ball, clearly. This High Septon seems to be like one of the true believers. He's like calling for the gods to intervene. Like, that's not something a semi-believer expects to happen. You gotta really, really believe to think that's gonna happen. Like, this guy seems to have kind of gone off the deep end even, maybe. So yeah, it was Lord Martin's great-grandfather, Manfred, that obeyed, that listened to the High Septon when the High Septon had 7 days. By the way, I didn't mention it at the time. The High Sparrow mentions that vision. Mentions that the High Septon preached surrender. He tells that to Cersei. So that's kind of interesting, given all the potential for Cersei to maybe blow up the Sept, or that get blown up through some other means. Maybe Dany does it. After all, Maegor did torch the Sept of Remembrance, which also would have looked odd to the Hightowers. Like, you're burning this entire Sept, man? Like, that's not good. Like, yeah, the warrior sons were all camped out in there, and yeah, they're fighting against you, but that's too much, man. But it also showed, no, this guy is not just talking. Like, he has already burned a Sept. So when this threat to burn the Starry Sept, you can see why people took it seriously. You can see why thousands of people fled the city. You can see why thousands of people treated it like the apocalypse, because they're like, yeah, well, this guy has proven multiple times that he will burn what he says he will burn. At first, Martin seemed to be backing the High Septon. Like, yeah, you're right. Call down the wrath of the gods. Maybe he didn't see a way out of it. Maybe he couldn't figure out a way to maneuver the situation to something more peaceable. So when a High Septon says things loudly that you agree with, you let him go. But what do you do when the High Septon, you agree? Not only do you agree with him, you say, yes, this is the will of the gods. But what do you do when the will of the gods is going to get you killed? You gotta do something, right?
Maybe you have faith that the gods will intervene.
You might.
There's no way Stannis could beat Renly, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. So maybe that's what he thought. But then as the days went by and the gods didn't intervene, and it became clear that Maegor was going to arrive soon, well, maybe you just got to find a new will of the gods. Like, it's like, maybe we need a new will here. Someone else write us one. Anyway, quote.
The men of the city watch filled sacks with sand and pails with water to fight the fires they knew were coming. Along the city walls, crossbows, scorpions, spitfires, and spear throwers were hoisted onto the battlements in hopes of bringing down the dragons when they appeared. Led by Ser Morgan Hightower, a younger brother of the Lord of Oldtown, 200 warriors' sons spilled forth from their chapter house to defend his high holiness, surrounding the starry sept with a ring of steel. Atop the high tower, the great beacon fire turned a baleful green as Lord Martin Hightower called his banners. Oldtown waited for the dawn and the coming of the dragons. And the dragons came. Vhagar first, as the sun was rising, then Balerion just before midday. But they found the gates of the city open, the battlements unmanned, and the banners of House Targaryen, House Tyrell, and House Hightower flying side by side atop the city walls. The Dowager Queen Visenya was the first to learn the news, sometime during the blackest hour of that long and dreadful night. The High Septon had died.
So just like the first High Septon that surrendered, his thing seems so engineered. This seems very clearly engineered as well, right? Like pretty clearly straightforward. Like no way was that a coincidence, especially because this dude was healthy. He was known to be someone who just had endless energy. He could preach for a day and a night without getting tired. He was famous for his energy level. So yeah, maybe he just burned out and dropped dead, but so unlikely, so unlikely. I mean, it's hard for me to believe. It's almost hard for me to even consider that as a possibility. It's only in there because, well, it is technically possible. You know, a person can die at any time, you know. But no, I mean, yeah, the timing is, we expect he was murdered, but who did it? Like, did Martin just like pretend like he was going to fight just to show his strength, and then, oh, well, the High Septon died, and now, well, that changes everything. So he doesn't want to look like a coward, or I don't know, but the text gives us a lot of options. Here's some more quote.
Some say that his high holiness took his own life in what was either the act of a craven afraid to face the wrath of King Maegor, or a noble sacrifice to spare the good folk of Oldtown from dragonfire. Others claim the Seven struck him down for the sin of pride, for heresy, treason, and arrogance. Many and more remain certain he was murdered. But by whom? Ser Morgan Hightower did the deed at the command of his lord brother, some say. And Ser Morgan was seen entering and leaving the High Septon's privy chambers that night. Others point to the lady, Patrice Hightower, Lord Martin's maiden aunt and a reputed witch, who did indeed seek an audience with his high holiness at dusk, though he was alive when she departed. The archmaesters of the citadel are also suspected, though whether they made use of the dark arts, an assassin, or a poisoned scroll is still a matter of some debate. Messages went back and forth between the citadel and the Starry Sept all night, and there are still others who hold them all blameless and lay the High Septon's death at the door of another rumored sorceress, the Dowager Queen Visenya Targaryen. The truth will likely never be known, but the swift reaction of Lord Martin when word reached him at the High Tower is beyond dispute.
Yeah, it's notable that the High Septon was calling for the gods to intervene against Maegor and Visenya, and he's the one who died. And people are like, that's the will of the gods. That's who the gods struck down. That's funny. The Citadel is an interesting possibility. Like, I don't think they poisoned the High Septon, although it is, again, can't dismiss it, can't rule it out. But it is interesting that they had all these messages going back and forth all night. The Citadel's like trying to reason with him, like, dude, this can't be the right way to proceed. Just yell at Maegor until he comes and burns the city. Like, how is that gonna result in a win for the faith? Like, how can we possibly go down this path? But the Citadel has limited means to do anything about it other than reason with him, except if we take this notion of a poisoned scroll seriously, which we don't know if that's even a thing. I don't know of any examples of poisoned scrolls. Although I wouldn't put it past, like, the Faceless Men to come up with something like that. Still, it seems kind of like they're just throwing darts at a dartboard here. Like, well, it could have been the Citadel because it could have been the Citadel. Not because there's any direct evidence. Like, messages isn't much evidence.
Yeah. Almost anyone has motivation because everyone's scared of just getting burned to death, right?
You're right. That's what makes it so hard. It's like every single person is like, shut up, High Septon.
And not just personal fear, but they're afraid for like their city, their families, their compatriots, their history, and everything else is connected to it. Like but maybe also themselves. Which I imagine this would be the makings of a really intriguing episode, at least of a TV show, if not a movie or whatever. But just to see the inside, to see this interaction. And I thought a lot about it too. I think another suspect is just some other Septon or group of Septons. They might he might be preaching all this, but all the people under him are like, look, man, like
right.
You gotta, and maybe they were like, hey, Citadel, is there any precedent? Can you research your books and find something to tell them?
Can we remove him from office somehow? Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah,
send us some poison. We'll poison him. Like, I can imagine multiple people like coming and going, and maybe even some people around him being convinced by all the other arguments going to him and him not accepting it, but everyone else is realizing the danger that they didn't know was there because of the dragons or the options they have to do something different, and on and on.
You're right, though. That's a good catch. And the faith aren't mentioned. His fellow faithful are not mentioned as the potential murderers here, which they should be. I mean, I'm not saying they're any more suspect than the rest, but like you say, pretty much everyone had the incentive to get rid of this guy.
Yeah.
The only one I don't believe is Visenya, because like she's on her dragon flying there. Like, how is she going to arrange for this guy's death? And part of her
magic.
Yeah. She's casted spells from Dragonback. Yeah, like doom. So yeah, that doesn't really work for me. So anyway, Patrice Hightower, again, she gets mentioned as a witch, and she was in his presence, so that's circumstantial. But I mean, I wouldn't cast her aside. Like, if her nephew is like, we got to get rid of the High Septon, she might be a means to make that happen. On the other hand, it's already an established prejudice against women in Westeros that poison is a woman's weapon or a Dornish weapon. So yeah, that's more likely why she's suspected. But she's more likely than a lot of these other ones. At least she's an individual, where the rest is like the Citadel. Like, well, who? That's like the Citadel's a lot of people. Morgan Hightower, though, this is the guy that I think we should be most suspicious of. Yes, he explicitly went into the chambers and left. So he was definitely in the High Septon's presence. That by itself doesn't tell you the story. Nina agrees, and let's get into why he's the most suspicious by far. Martin immediately ordered the arrest of his own brother, but not just his brother, all the warrior sons, but his brother was the captain of the Old Town chapter of Warrior Sons. So he orders them all arrested, which is interesting. It's like, why did he order them arrested? Was it because for Maegor's benefit, to show that he had these people locked up or whatever, even though these particular group wasn't probably guilty of anything, unless they were guilty potentially of murdering Lord Hightower. I mean, sorry, the High Septon. So either he felt strongly with regards who to blame, or he was doing a show for Maegor, or it was a setup to hide the real killer. There's a lot of possible. Just like, because it's so hard to pin down the real killer, it's so hard to pin down Martin's motivation and his angle here. But they definitely waited for Maegor to hold the trial. Like, they had him preside over the trial, and that was important to he's the king. He's the one who dispenses justice, so they didn't want to do that without him. That's his authority. And before Maegor got there, though, remember it said Visenya arrived first, and Maegor arrived like at the break of day. Martin immediately sent a bunch of spearmen to the most devout and was like, "You're choosing a new High Septon before Maegor gets here. Like we got to do this now. Kind of not quite like Stannis locking the Night's Watch in a room and being like, "You're choosing a Lord Commander today." We're like this. We're done with this. But it's somewhat similar to that. So of course they're like reminding them, these spearmen. I'm sure the captain, whoever Martin sent, was given some very specific orders as to what to say. He's like, if you choose unwisely, we're all gonna burn. Make sure. And what I mean by unwisely is choose someone that's kind of soft or is gonna do what Maegor wants. Like this isn't hard, y'all. Like this isn't tricky.
Someone that can interpret the faith more symbolically and less literally or whatever.
Yes, yes. So they picked a 90-year-old man who could barely stand the weight of the crown. He's so, like, old that he couldn't even remember all the words during the coronation ceremony. So this is clearly a figurehead guy. But the ceremony was official, and they did another coronation, making crowned Maegor again to, like, authenticate his usurpation, which... that had to make him, like, that was a plus for him. He liked that. And, like, this is, see, Maegor? This is what you get. You get an official coronation that kind of legitimizes your reign here rather than burning us all. Isn't that better? And so that was a big deal. Visenya was satisfied with that, and she went back to Dragonstone while Maegor proceeded to stay and dispense justice. He was there for 6 months. The new aged High Septon... Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I want to ask a question real quick. They chose a 90-year-old man that could barely take the weight of the crown. That's the crystal crown.
Yeah, that big crystal crown that the High Sparrow later sells to feed the poor.
I was trying to remember if that was still in existence in current times. It seemed, and I had this idea in my mind that the High Sparrow would probably just sell that to help. It was
a new one, actually. The one that was sold by High Sparrow is a new one, because the old one, which might not even be this one, but the High Sparrow, remember the High Septon died in the riot, the bread riot, when Joffrey started the riot there, and they dragged him off of his litter and killed him, and he was wearing the crystal crown. So the crystal crown was like destroyed and pulled into a million pieces there, if I remember correctly. So maybe that was this crown. But
because I was thinking a crystal crown doesn't seem like something that would last for centuries.
That's true. That would fall apart. Yeah. It's the crown of Theseus. It doesn't have any of its original parts. Mm-hmm. And so the High Septon, of course, taking orders or the advice of the most devout and or Lord Martin, dissolved the warriors' sons. And the poor fellow, like, they're gone. Like, they are no longer an official order. Anyone in that order that doesn't lay down their arms is an outlaw. You've got a year to comply. Okay, so they gave him a little bit of time. So this is almost certainly one of the behind-the-scenes negotiations made with Maegor. Like, yeah, we'll give you your coronation, and you do this, you don't burn us. But Maegor's like, but you got to, like, also get rid of these orders. This has to be an official thing. Like, we're done with them. High Septon and the most devout were like, yeah, we agree. And of course, Balerion was right there, so of course they were going to agree. As an aside, I wonder, was Balerion too large to land atop the Hightower? We know Silverwing landed up there, so it's not out of the question, but Balerion might just be too big for that. But boy, would that look cool. Landing next to that green flame, if it was still green when... They may have changed the green back to normal by the time Maegor got there, because they're like, no, we don't want him to think we're fighting him. Turn that off. But man, that would look cool. So the warriors' son, remember, some of the warriors' sons were arrested right away. Like, that's what Martin did immediately upon the death of the High Septon. Not only did he rouse the most devout and force them to choose a new leader, he rounded up all the warriors. Remember, he arrested his own brother. And they were given a choice. Of course, they had to renounce the order because the order's been dissolved. So they had to renounce the order no matter what, and take the black or face execution. If they didn't renounce the order / take the black, they would die. A quarter of them chose death. The seven of them came from famous families, and Maegor executed them personally with Blackfire. The rest were executed by their former brothers. Yet somehow, one person was pardoned. Only one person was pardoned, and it was Sir Morgan Hightower, the former captain of the Warriors' Sons, and brother to the Lord of Hightower. Somehow he was spared all this, which is, of course...
How convenient.
Yeah, gosh. Doesn't look fishy at all, does it? So this might have been part of the deal. Like, whatever behind-the-scenes negotiation. Okay, so Morgan gets a pardon. The Warriors' Sons are dissolved. The rest go to the Wall. This and that. But there was another thing, and most of these things seem to be in Maegor's favor. What did the Hightowers get out of it? Well, there's a thing or two. We'll see in a minute. But yeah, like ultra fishy. Like, come on. Like, y'all, that's so blatant, right? But who's going to do anything about it? Well, I'll tell you. Someone is going to do something about it. We'll see in a minute. But first off, Anthony De Palma sends a super chat and says, "Late to the party. Bartender hours aren't ideal for catching y'all." No, they aren't. That's a late night thing, especially on a Saturday night. He says, "Just thought I'd say hello. Nice to finally be here, and I want a Knives Out movie in this setting." That's a great idea, man. Great idea. And thanks for making it to the party. I know it's difficult. It is difficult to make a afternoon live stream after a Saturday night of bartending, I'm sure. So yeah, we appreciate your presence, my friend. So yeah, the coronation as well. Sean, do you have something to add here?
I was wondering how many people, when they said a quarter of them chose death over taking the black. I had a couple thoughts. One is it shows how
devout,
legitimate the Septon was for not accepting, willing to burn or whatever. It's crazy as it seemed to us. There's a bunch of other crazy people with them.
Those are pious folk. Yeah, it just goes to show that you can. It also adds to the why certain Hightower lords would be legitimately pious, because they like this. It's a strong cultural element there. Yeah, like you're right. Like a quarter of them, it chose death. Like I mean, instead of going to the wall, which they might have been like,
which might be death also.
Yeah, so you can kind of maybe see, and that eventually became a problem too. This is outside the scope of this episode, but recall that a lot of Warriors' Sons and former faithful were sent to the wall, and then a bunch of Maegor supporters were sent to the wall. They were
suddenly the people at the wall are going to be in conflict.
We don't like each other. You sent us here. We did, and now we're here with you.
A follow-up thought is, how many was that? He executed a quarter, and the other 3/4 went to the wall. Out of that was I think
it was 200.
The entire order, or just the captains?
Just the order at Old Town. I think it was at least 200.
200. So that means that Maegor beheaded 50 people.
No, remember, Maegor only executed the nobles among them. So only 7 of them were nobles. Their former brothers executed the others.
Right.
Yeah, so it would have been like 40 plus killed.
That's also pretty awful,
yes,
but yes. Geez.
It's true. Yeah, it would have been a bloody day. Yeah. So remember, the coronation's a big deal. As I said, there's still the usurped line completely untouched, just sitting there. Maegor wasn't threatened by them, in part because they weren't even with their dragons. When Maegor made his move, they were just in the west doing royal progress stuff without their dragons. When Maegor seized King's Landing, their dragons were there. So they didn't have access to their dragons, except they maybe did while he was in Old Town. And that's kind of what happened. So we'll get to that in a second, but it was almost certainly part of the the arrangements. So the faith was already predisposed against Aegon and Rhaena. As we said, the High Septon was like, "Are you kidding me? You married to a brother and sister after all this other stuff?" That's part of what got this started. So of course even though Maegor was awful and brutal and murdering faithful, well, the other branch of the Targaryens was engaged in straight up incest and weren't threatening them with a dragon, the biggest one. So you could see why they had to go along with Maegor. They may have wanted to, but they also had to. So remember, Cerise was back in Old Town at this point, though. She had returned because she was sick of the healing hands of Septon Creepy Murmison. And this was an opportunity. And I'm guessing that among the things they negotiated with Maegor, along with, we'll do these things you want, but you have to take Cerise back, which he did. But it came with some extra considerations. They had to concede a few other things. So here we go. Quote.
Sorry, I wasn't ready for this. Sorry. During his time, right?
Yeah.
During his time at Old Town, the king was also reconciled with his first wife, Queen Cerise, the sister of his host, Lord Hightower. Her Grace agreed to accept the king's other wives, to treat them with respect and honor and speak no further ill against them, whilst Maegor swore to restore Cerise. While Maegor swore to restore Cerise all the rights, incomes, privileges due her as his wedded wife and queen. A great feast was held at the Hightower to celebrate the reconciliation. The revels even included a bedding and a second consummation, so all men would know this to be true and loving union.
True and loving union. Yeah, it's anything but that. So all people would be convinced of this bold lie. So this was backing them up. This was like also a way to make sure Maegor would have their support if it came to war against the other branch of the family, which it did soon after this, because while he was down in Old Town, Aegon and Rhaena realized they could make their move. And either way, the Hightowers didn't want to make an enemy of him, especially when he was right there. But Maegor wasn't an idiot. He did kind of go, maybe there's evidence that maybe he lost his mind a bit as things went on, like power went to his head, cruelty, maybe he went crazy over time like Aerys may have. Maybe he had some mental health issues that caused him to lose his grip on reality. Who knows? The thing is, early on, he was brutal, but he wasn't stupid. He did a lot of clever things. He knew he needed allies. He knew he wouldn't be able to hold the throne and rule Westeros without powerful houses behind him. So with the Hightowers in his camp, he could proceed with a lot more confidence. Like, okay, I've got the Hightowers behind me. Now I'm a lot more formidable than I was. And it was natural for many reasons, this alliance, because as we said, they were already together. They already had the pre-existing marriage. But of course, there are these issues. The war against the Faith Militant. Despite the way they dodged this bullet, it still isn't popular that he's at war with the Faith. Like, that's not a good thing, for their relationship with him. But so you kind of wonder, some Hightowers might have been like, oh, this is bad. We didn't want Cerise to be close again with Maegor. We wanted to further separate ourselves from this guy. But again, we're not sure what they really thought of it. And despite that, they may have realized they weren't really getting into bed with Maegor too much, because this marriage hadn't produced any kids and they weren't any younger, right? Cerise was like 40 by this point, so the odds weren't getting better of her having children. So it seemed like this alliance might have had an expiration date. If kids are going to be brought into it, then it could who knows? Like, you've got family members born, and that could keep this in place for generations. But with no kids, you can see it ending. And then the Hightowers are like, okay, well, we're free and clear of Maegor because we won't actually have a family connection anymore. So they may have looked forward to that day and just been like, we got to wait all this out. But because also, this is before Maegor's horrific infants were born, the ones that had just creepy things wrong with them, some of them a little draconic, some of them just like missing eyes and limbs and all that. None of that had happened yet. This is later in his reign. So, and people started calling those children like abominations, like the punishment of the gods. That would have also really altered the picture here of their desire to be in a relationship with him and an alliance with him, because things just turned south so bad. But they hadn't yet. So that's really important. Just like it was a problem regarding the incest of Rhaenys and Aegon, though, they were against him. Maegor's polygamy was against church dictates, and he was going to get worse with that as well. He was going to marry 3 more people and do it in a really horrible way. But that also hadn't happened yet. That's going to be in our next episode. We won't even get to that today, because
the next episode's going to be horrible.
Yeah, it's going to start off pretty horrible, yeah. But I mean, it's Maegor the Cruel, right? So yeah, this is the year 43, and Maegor's reign was 6 years. This is only the second year of his reign. So while he's in the south, before he's fully established, Aegon and Rhaena may not even known that Maegor was pretty successful down there, how it all was going. Either way, they made their move. They snuck into King's Landing in disguise, and there was no dragon pit yet, and the Red Keep wasn't finished. So this isn't like now where it's hard to sneak in places. This was a city under construction. These things weren't complete. Like I said, the dragon pit wasn't even started, let alone finished, and the Red Keep wasn't finished. So, it's not as like lockdown, tight security kind of thing. So they get into the city with some help, grab their dragons, fly out, and with their dragons, they're able to raise an army. It's like, okay, now we're a serious threat. Maegor did not dally. He left Old Town quickly, and presumably news would have arrived by Raven. And you wonder, like, did the Citadel, did they delay giving this news to him, or did they rush it to him? You know, you wonder, there's room for some manipulation here. I mean, this is the center of communications for Westeros. This is the Ravenry. Like, this is where they hand out the Maester's chain link for Ravenry skill and where they're all trained. And yeah, it's pretty important. Knowledge is power. That's no conspiracy. What they do with that knowledge, there's all sorts of conspiracy we could imagine, some of which might actually be true, but the actual knowledge, that's truth. So, but in this case, I can't see any reason for them to mess around too much. Maegor's there. They just recommitted to him. You know, I think they probably still wanted him to win at this point because, again, he wasn't as awful as he was going to be. So you wonder if the Hightowers supplied any troops for this. I'm guessing they didn't, or if they did, the troops never got involved because Maegor flew north on Balerion. The troops couldn't have possibly kept up with him. So maybe they were marching to join him later. But the whole thing was over.
It's really easy for them to say, like, yeah, we'll give you all the troops you want. Mm-hmm. They're not going to get there anyway.
Yeah, so because the thing was over before they could have marched in there anyway. So even if they didn't help, even if they did help, they couldn't have gotten there in time to matter. So because Maegor, again, not an idiot. He understood the scenario, especially when it comes to war. This is a guy that definitely understood battle and all that stuff. So he realized that Aegon needed to win a victory. He needed to have a win under his belt in order for people to take him seriously. There were a lot of lords on the fence that wouldn't have taken either side because they're just like, they have no idea who's going to win here, and they don't want to get caught in the middle. There's not really that. It's not that big a deal to sit out. Like Maegor isn't probably going to kill every single person that sat on the sidelines. So a lot of people just sat back and were like, we're not doing anything. But if Aegon had won a victory, they would have joined him. And Maegor knew that. So he was like, well, I'm going to get to him as quick as possible and make sure he doesn't win a single victory so he can't bring any new houses on his side and just nip this in the bud quickly. And he's going to do that personally by flying Balerion into the heat of the action. So there was a conflict. And yeah, if there were Hightowers on the march to join him, which is entirely possible, yeah, they didn't get there in time because Balerion just killed Aegon, and that was that. The war ended. By 44 AC, the following year, Maegor was firmly entrenched, and Cerise came to court. She moved back from Old Town to the Red Keep, which was only almost finished then, and she went and this will be her first experience living with the other queens. There'd be Tiana and Alice Haraway there. That super old High Septon who did all the things Maegor wanted died because he was really old, and he was replaced by a man who came to be known as the High Lickspittle. So this guy was even more of a patsy. And the poor fellows in revolt were so unhappy with this choice is that they, in response to the naming of this man, they named their own High Septon. Septon Moon, of an infamous guy who we've talked about in some of our Fire and Blood coverage in mock response. So they basically have like a papal schism, the equivalent of that, where there's two popes out there, or the unofficial one and the chosen one of the chosen one of the nobility and the chosen of the people, or some people.
Just anyway. Ask the two popes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Most ideal form of the most ideal form of leadership. Two leaders.
So it had been a full year. The amnesty for poor fellows and warrior sons was over. So they had a year to lay down their weapons. So, but clearly the ones who hadn't laid them down by then weren't gonna, and Maegor had already put out the bounties: a gold dragon for a warrior's son, a silver for a poor fellow. Surely no one killed innocent people and claimed they were otherwise. No, there's no way that happened. We didn't see that with dwarfs under Cersei and Tyrion, did we? No, that never happens. Yeah. So the Red Dog of the Hills, Sir Joffrey Doggett, another Joffrey here, it was one of the key leaders of the Faith Militant uprising. And mostly he was active in the north. Not the north, like Winterfell, but like far north of Old Town, like the Golden Tooth area, north of the Golden Tooth. So more like in the Riverlands and part of the Westerlands. But he was powerful enough to have a lot of reach. And they began assassinating people. They began killing people on the road, people they saw as traitors, nobles that weren't pious enough. And one of these that they killed was Sir Morgan Hightower. They were like, you got away with that? No, you didn't. They killed him. They murdered that dude on the road.
Not pardoned after all.
He was pardoned by his brother, but not pardoned by the people, not by the faith militant. So that guy was killed, and he had been a former, obviously a commander of the Warriors' son. So that was like, they clearly killed him for being a turncloak, or in their mind, he was a traitor. Now, I don't know what his role was at this point. He clearly wasn't commander of the Warriors' sons anymore. He may have just been a knight of House Hightower, which is pretty prominent anyway. But either way, that's a pretty big deal. They killed him, and you can only wonder what Lord Martin's reaction was to this. This wasn't far away. This was close. This was on the road from Old Town to the Honeyholt. The Honeyholt is the seat of the Beesburys. The Beesburys will have a reasonably important role in the next episode, because Lord Breezebury, the one killed in House of the Dragon, that guy is Master of Coin for 50 years or something. So he's Master of Coin from way before the events of House of the Dragon start, and we know House of the Dragon starts 30 years before the war, almost 30 years. So they're gonna have some issues later. Honeyholt will have issues with their lord at the Old Town because of these clashes. Not to mention, a knight of Honeyholt was among the Warriors' sons slain by Maegor when he had that famous trial of 7, which, by the way, I didn't even mention as one of the reasons Maegor had some claim to the throne. He won a trial by 7, saying, I'm the king now. Who's gonna say otherwise? And the Warriors' sons said, we will, and he beat them. So, if you're some faithful gotta say, the gods have already spoken.
If you're devout enough to die rather than go to the wall, you gotta be devout enough to accept the trial of the 7, right?
So it's really a weird spot.
Or do you pick and choose? It seems like everyone just picks and chooses.
So you can see why there's issues between Honeyholt and the Hightower at this point, maybe, and maybe more issues later. But so he's murdered on the road there, and that's so far from the Golden Tooth. If you look at the map, where Joffrey Doggett's men were is nowhere remotely near this. So that just goes to show how powerful the Faith Militant were, and how many high-powered or important people were getting assassinated by them in this area. The roads weren't safe for a lot of people unless you really traveled in force. And so that's a pretty huge deal. And yeah, what did Martin do? Did he send men out to hunt down the killers? Probably did at least that much, but he may not have expected much result from it, because these men just vanish into the hedges and forests and live in caves like the Brotherhood Without Banners. It's hard to hunt them down. It's like chasing guerrilla fighters in Dorne. If you go off the beaten path, you're in their turf, and all of a sudden you are subject to ambush, and being in full plate mail is a disadvantage, and all these, it just changes the theater of war. It's a whole different type of scenario. Maegor actually relaxed his campaign against the Faith because he was concerned with establishing his power and finishing the Red Keep, and maybe planning the Dragon Pit, which got kicked off not long after the Red Keep. It was the same year. So he finished the Red Keep in the year 45. Later that year, he started the Dragon Pit, which he might have started even sooner. But remember, he killed all the builders of the Red Keep so they wouldn't do the secrets. So
reveal the secrets, yeah.
Which made it hard to, find new builders. They're like, well, no, I don't want to work for
Not
you.
only are there less builders to find, the ones that are there are less experienced and more suspicious.
Yeah. So. Now, less likely to kill them because there aren't these secret passageways in the Dragon Pit, but they're still why take that chance, So, but the thing that really, so from afar, the Hightowers are this dude is just slowly getting worse and worse. He's slowly frittering away his authority. What he won by intimidation and outright violence, he's losing through intimidation and outright violence. It is a two-edged sword, and it's Blackfire, so it's a very sharp two-edged sword. And it gave the Hightowers reasons to maybe reconsider if they weren't already reconsidering this relationship with Maegor. And because of the killing of the builders and the recurring, all the brutality against the faith, which just kept escalating and escalating. So at this time, though, 45 AC, Cerise dies of a sudden illness, so they say. But no one believes it because apparently Maegor ordered her tongue removed. And we know she was outspoken. And we know she didn't seem to be afraid of him like a lot of other people were. So she seemed brave, but apparently maybe she went too far here, because he ordered her tongue removed apparently, and one of the Kingsguard in the process of doing this killed her by accident. And they're like, later we're told that this story was considered false later by later generations. Like they're like, this is just a way to blacken Maegor's name. Like, blacken Maegor's name? Like, how can you make it any blacker? Like, it's like y'all remember the movie Spinal Tap when they wanted their album to be just black as possible. And they're like, people will say, how much blacker can this get? None more black. It's like, it's so.
I was thinking about Metalocalypse. Yeah, blacker than the blackest black.
Yeah, and like how can this be worse? So, a different Kingsguard, the one who supposedly held her down while she was having her tongue removed, said, "Oh, she didn't die because of being stabbed. She died because of her shrewishness." Which is like confirming it. Like, you're confirming that she didn't die of an illness. You're confirming that Maegor was tired of hearing her talk and had her killed because he's an asshole, and so that's probably what happened. And it almost doesn't matter what really happened, because it's said, yes, later generations questioned that story, but in the moment, everyone believed it. Everyone believed that's what happened, which means the public perception was that Maegor murdered Cerise Hightower. How can the Hightowers be like, oh, okay, that's fine?
Yeah.
Like, they no longer have their tie to him. That's their connection to Maegor is, yeah, we crowned you here, but we no longer have a family connection to you. And you're falling apart here. You're just like frittering everything away. You're blowing it. This is our out. This is our exit. And now, yeah. So there's no immediate reaction that we're told about from the Hightowers. If they had any soldiers at court or knights or whatever, you got to think they would have come home. They were like, okay, well, that's that. We can't support this guy anymore. But they wouldn't have maybe wanted to make a big show about it because he's so violent and nasty, and you don't want to like provoke him needlessly. Like, the guy still has Balerion. So, wow. So that's where we're gonna leave it for today, because it's the turning point in the relationship with the Hightowers and House Targaryen here in the early reign of the Iron Throne. It's going to completely change the picture. And then, of course, we're going to move into Jaehaerys' reign and all these other things. So, though the Faith militant uprising is cited as beginning in 41 AC, which is before Maegor took the throne. Maegor took the throne in 42 AC. It would also continue after his death. So we're going to be covering that, the extended continuation of the Faith militant after his death. And yeah, throughout all this, though, the heart of Westerosi faith in the Seven is still at Old Town. Remember, we're still a ways away from that shift happening where the heart of the faith is in King's Landing. Like, King's Landing, it still isn't the largest city in the realm at this point, although it's getting closer and closer, and we don't exactly know when it passed. But yeah. So I have so many questions. Were the Hightowers starting to keep their distance? Were they more aggressive in their distancing themselves from Maegor? Was it continued tightrope walk where they're like, well, we definitely don't want to piss this guy off. He still could come and burn the Starry Sept. Like, there is nothing we could do if he did that. So they still have like a lot of pragmatic reasons to just take it lying down, even though these insults are hefty and they murdered a member of their family, or he murdered a member of their family. So
they have a lot of influence too, and they aren't necessarily a monolith. Yeah. So, one of my thoughts is that probably anything that's very public or visual, or that they would expect Maegor to be paying attention to, they just keep it like it is. But Maegor might not understand like the building contracts and the trade routes and the taxes being collected, things that they can manipulate to peel back on, you know what I mean? To get less involved, or even to work against the crown, or pull into their own resources. And like, I guess these soldiers that we already have there, we'll just leave them. But
Cut our
hey, if
losses.
someone gets sick, we're not sending any more soldiers. There, we're not gonna fund the defense of this trade route, or we're not gonna send taxes from this spot anymore. Like any
Little
angle they
things.
could find that they
Yeah.
think won't get noticed, which would be a lot like the influence they have through the Maesters and through the Septs and through the trade and
They would have all
everything
the
else.
avenues to look for other options. They're like, who do we
Right.
talk to? Well,
Exactly.
whoever we want to. We've got everyone. We can talk to anyone. Like
Yeah.
that's the thing. They have those lines of communication. Yeah, that's a great point. They can send a raven to the Starks if they want to talk about it. They can send to the Iron Islands or something. Yeah, to Essos. Who knows?
Yeah, did you guys know Maegor did this? Are you sure you want to send more troops for that?
Yeah.
Like, why don't you set up a trade route with us instead of King's Landing? We'll give you this bonus, and you don't have to worry about Maegor.
Because if we're all
Yeah.
together in this, even Maegor and Balerion won't be enough. Like, we can beat him if we're united in this. He can't burn everyone.
And we don't necessarily even have to like overthrow him violently. We just have to wait it out, man. Just have to wait it out. He'll die eventually. Maybe someone poisons him. Hey, not that we're condoning that, but hey, if it happens, the Citadel can give you some advice.
That's right. We know a thing or two about poisons. You're right. And it's, as it turns out, Maegor's death is a mystery.
Suspicious.
Like, it's very
Yeah.
suspicious. We don't know what happened. It probably wasn't poison because he was found.
And similar
impaled
to
on
that
a throne.
Septon, lots of people have a motivation.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's very interesting. But and consider the other side. Like, well, what side will they take? Will they take? Right now, there is no side to take. Like, Jaehaerys isn't really the available option. Jaehaerys isn't even the oldest living member of the other branch at this point. A male member of the other branches. There's Viserys, who was Maegor's squire. That's the eldest after the Aegon who was killed. So Jaehaerys was third in line before his elder brother was killed riding Quicksilver, and then there's a whole nother one in between them. Maegor, of course, is going to kill him too, but that hasn't happened yet. So the Hightowers are in a tough position. They don't want to side with the Faith Militant. The Faith Militant killed Sir Morgan. They're not like excited about those guys either. Like, and plus they have no like noble clout and no money and any of that. That's not what the Hightowers are generally getting mixed up in the first place. You'd think that rather than side with the Faith Militant, they would just step aside and side with nobody. But it is possible some elements of House Hightower, if not even the main elements, were secretly supporting the rebels. It's possible they preferred that to, rock and a hard place. Maybe you got to pick someone, they thought. Maybe they supported both sides, like later instances of House Hightower or House Swan or other houses have done, like the Butterwells. Like, support both sides. That way we come
Hedge your bets.
Yeah, that's right. So that could have been the way they did. So yeah, as we wrap this episode halfway through Maegor's reign, it should be said that things got much worse before they got better. But they did get better. So if we look back at these 45 years, we can assume the continued progress and prosperity of the city itself, even while these other things are happening. The city itself is probably doing pretty darn well, since it didn't get burned, and the Dornish incursion stopped. The Ironborn raids had stopped a while ago. The city was probably doing great, other than that big scare of Maegor. But that would have been pretty short term, all things all told, right? So yeah, that's pretty good. And so they have room to do other things, an example of which we'll see next episode as well, like naval exploration. That's going to be a part of next time. We'll get to think about other ways that might have come out. Other things like, this is basically a preview of next week, the fall of Maegor, the rest of Faith Militant's rebellion, the Golden Age under Jaehaerys and Alysanne, the passing of Lord Martin, the rule of Donald the Delayer Hightower. Like I said, the seafaring thing, that's Eustace and Norman going with Alyssa Farman. The Shivers hits Old Town. Then we get to things like Otto Hightower and Viserys and Alicent and Brynden Hightower, Gwaine Hightower, Hobart Hightower, Lord Ormond. All that stuff. That should be good times. I'm looking forward to that. Power shifts more towards King's Landing and away from Old Town. The faith shifts more towards Old Town. Towards King's Landing. You wonder if the Hightowers were concerned about their influence waning a little bit. Maybe they did some moves to try to retain that. Yeah. A lot of things up and under Jaehaerys. So, and then Viserys after him. So a lot of interesting stuff to come yet. We shall get on that next week. A couple of episodes I mentioned that are relevant to this one that you might want to consider listening to stay involved. There is several of our Fire and Blood topics that are relevant to this one. I mentioned, I guess, the Shivers would be one. Our episode on the Red Kraken, which is a subscribers-only one, that came up as well, of course, as the re-beginning of the old way in some respects there. And I'm sure there's some other ones, but I'm spacing out on them at the moment. Our full Dance of the Dragons coverage as well, maybe should be worth mentioned, or maybe is worth mentioning. That's, of course, with Radio Westeros and is fully scripted. Yeah, so next week we'll continue down the timeline and probably finish it off. I guess there's a chance that it's too much for one episode, but I think we'll be able to cover it. Famous last words. Or famous start of lots more words.
Yeah.
Lots, yeah.
Famous mid-roll words.
Yeah, anyway, we'll deal with that. So thanks everyone for coming. Thanks if you watched live or if you're catching it afterwards, whether you consume it on YouTube or on one of the many podcast platforms that hosts it. We appreciate that. You can give us a like or a thumbs up or a subscription, voluntary subscription. That's, of course, one of the best ways to support us, but there's lots of ways to do that. Tell a friend. That's one of my favorite methods. You, as a person with friends, those friends value your opinion. So if you tell them to listen to us, well, that'll go farther than just about anyone else, I would think, making that same request. Yeah. As well, thanks to Nina for the excellent notes. Lots of great thoughts that helped me sort through some of these difficulties. Lots of different things happening all at once. A lot of times it's hard to sort through all the different possibilities, especially with a fair amount of unknowns thrown into the mix. But I think we did a solid job here. I'm pretty pleased with the way it came out. Hope you are too. As well, thank you to those of you who support us financially. That's the best way to support, like I said. As well, thanks to Joey, Jesse, and Bran for the intro music, outro music, video intro, and all the various things that make our show seem more professional. Yes. And Michael Klarfeld as well. The maps behind me that you see variations of over the years, it's usually this known world map, but we have other ones up from time to time. You can go to his site, claradox.de. That's KLARADOX.de. to get copies for yourself. Lots of different ones out there. And last but not least, thank you to the Bengineer for doing the sound quality management before he hands it over to me for the final editorial cuts and final version of the episode. Yeah. All right, everyone. That's our show. We'll see you next time for more. And you know what to do. In the meantime, Valar, read us.